Welcome, dear listener, to a journey into one of history's darkest chapters, the witch trials that swept across Europe and colonial America, leaving thousands dead and entire communities torn apart by fear, suspicion, and mass hysteria. Tonight, as you settle into comfort and prepare for rest, we will explore the witch hunts not with sensationalism, but with understanding. We seek to comprehend how rational people could come to believe that their neighbors were servants of the devil, how legal systems could condemn the innocent, and how fear could spread like wildfire through communities, consuming reason and mercy in its flames. This is a story that transcends simple tales of good and evil. It is a story about human psychology, about social dynamics, about the terrible power of belief unchecked by evidence. It is a story about how quickly civilization's veneer can crack when fear takes hold, and how ordinary people can become both victims and perpetrators of extraordinary injustice. We will walk the streets of Salem in 1692, where girls' strange fits sparked a panic that would claim 19 lives. We will journey across the Atlantic to the European witch hunts that preceded Salem by centuries, where tens of thousands died on stakes and scaffolds. We will examine the beliefs that made witch trials possible, the procedures that turned suspicion into conviction, and the slow, painful process by which societies finally recognized the horror of what they had done. As always, our approach will be measured and thoughtful. While our subject is disturbing, we will explore it with the careful attention of historical inquiry, seeking not to disturb your rest, but to provide a contemplative journey through this dark terrain. The past has lessons to teach us, and these lessons are perhaps never more important than when we study how fear can overcome reason, how communities can turn against their own, and how the innocent can suffer when hysteria replaces justice. So breathe deeply, settle into your pillows, and prepare to journey back to a time when the woods seemed full of demons, when a neighbor's enmity could lead to accusations of witchcraft, and when the most respected members of society could participate in legal proceedings that sent innocent people to their deaths. Let us begin in Salem, Massachusetts, in the cold winter of 1692, where a few young girls' mysterious afflictions would set in motion one of the most famous witch hunts in history. The story of the Salem witch trials begins not with witches, but with children, specifically with two young girls in a Puritan minister's household, exhibiting strange and terrifying behaviors that no one could explain. Salem Village in 1692 was a small farming community on the edge of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was not Salem town, the prosperous port city nearby, but rather a rural settlement of perhaps 500 souls, living in wooden houses scattered across farmland carved from the wilderness. Life here was hard, governed by Puritan religious discipline and the constant struggle to survive in a harsh environment. The village was troubled even before the witch trials began. There were disputes over land boundaries, quarrels over the minister's salary, conflicts between farming families, and those with ties to Salem town's merchant economy. The community was divided between supporters and opponents of Reverend Samuel Parris, the controversial minister whose household would become ground zero for the witch panic. Samuel Parris had come to Salem Village in 1689, and his tenure had been contentious from the start. A failed merchant turned minister, Parris was rigid, uncompromising, and prone to seeing his disputes with parishioners as cosmic battles between good and evil. He preached sermons about invisible enemies and the devil's agents working to undermine godly communities. In retrospect, these sermons helped create a mental framework that made witch accusations thinkable. Parris lived with his wife Elizabeth, his 9-year-old daughter Betty, his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams, and two enslaved people he had brought from Barbados, a man named John Indian and a woman known to history as Tituba. It was in this household, in January 1692, that the Salem witch trials began. Betty Parris and Abigail Williams began to behave strangely. They would throw themselves on the floor, writhing and contorting their bodies into positions that seemed impossible. They made strange sounds, barking like dogs, screaming, speaking gibberish. They complained of being pricked and pinched by invisible hands. They had fits of crying and laughing that seemed beyond their control. In a Puritan community where children were expected to be seen and not heard, where quiet obedience was the highest virtue, this behavior was shocking and terrifying. The girls' symptoms seemed to come and go unpredictably. Sometimes they appeared normal, at other times, they fell into fits that left observers shaken and afraid. Reverend Parris consulted with other ministers and with the local doctor, William Griggs. The ministers prayed over the girls. The doctor examined them and found no physical cause for their symptoms. According to the account that has come down to us, Dr. Griggs eventually offered a diagnosis that would prove fateful the girls. He suggested, might be under an evil hand, they might be bewitched. This diagnosis opened a door that would not easily be closed. If the girls were bewitched, then there must be witches, real people in the community, who had made pacts with the devil and were using supernatural powers to afflict these children. The question became, who were the witches? At first, the adults tried to coax the names from the afflicted girls. Who was tormenting them? Who appeared to them in spectral form, pinching and tormenting them? The girls were reluctant to speak, perhaps frightened, perhaps enjoying the unprecedented attention they were receiving, perhaps genuinely uncertain about what was happening to them. But pressure mounted. In a culture that believed witchcraft was real and deadly, in a community already tense with conflict, in a household led by a minister who saw spiritual warfare everywhere, the girls eventually named names. In late February 1692, the girls accused 3 women: Tituba, the enslaved woman from Paris's own household; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who survived by asking neighbors for food and shelter; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had stopped attending church and had scandalized the community by living with a man before marrying him. These initial accusations followed a pattern that would repeat throughout the witch trials. The accused were marginal figures, outsiders, poor, or socially suspect. Tituba was a slave and a foreigner from a Caribbean culture that Puritans viewed with suspicion. Sarah Good was destitute and had the reputation of muttering curses when denied charity. Sarah Osborne was elderly, ill, and had violated social norms. None of these women had the social standing to defend themselves effectively. None had powerful allies who could come to their aid. They were vulnerable, and in a witch hunt, vulnerability was dangerous. Arrest warrants were issued, and on March 1, 1692, the 3 women were brought before magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin for examination. These were not trials in the formal sense, they were preliminary hearings to determine if there was sufficient evidence to hold the accused for trial. The examinations were public events, held in the Salem village meeting house, packed with spectators eager to see the accused witches confronted with their crimes. The magistrates acted more as prosecutors than neutral judges, asking leading questions designed to trap the accused into admissions of guilt. Sarah Good denied the charges, but could offer no explanation for the girls' afflictions. When asked if she had made a compact with the devil, she replied that she had not. When pressed on why the girls accused her, she suggested that perhaps it was Sarah Osborne who was the witch. This attempt to deflect suspicion onto another did her no good. Sarah Osborne also denied the charges. She had been ill and bedridden. She said how could she have traveled in spectral form to torment these girls? But the magistrates were not persuaded. If the devil could enable flight and invisibility, being bedridden was no defense. Then came Tituba's examination, and everything changed. Unlike the other 2 accused women, Tituba confessed. She admitted to being a witch. She provided vivid, detailed testimony about her encounters with the devil and other witches. Tituba described how a tall man dressed in black had come to her and asked her to serve him. She said she had seen his book, in which she and others had written their names. She spoke of a conspiracy of witches in Massachusetts, who met together and plotted against the godly. She described supernatural animals: a yellow bird, a hog, a great black dog that served the witches. She said she had been coerced into afflicting the children. Why did Tituba confess to something she almost certainly had not done? Several theories have been proposed. She may have been tortured or threatened by Paris before the examination. She may have believed that confession would save her life, and in this, she was correct. Unlike the accused who maintained their innocence, Tituba survived. She may have been trying to tell her interrogators what they clearly wanted to hear. She may have drawn on folk beliefs from her Barbadian background, weaving them into a narrative that matched Puritan demonology. Whatever her motivations, Tituba's confession was catastrophic. It confirmed the magistrate's worst fears. Witchcraft was not just a theoretical possibility but a present reality. There was indeed a conspiracy of witches in their midst. The devil was actively recruiting in Massachusetts. The 3 accused women were just the beginning. There must be others. The afflicted girls' fits intensified during Tituba's examination. They cried out that they saw Tituba's specter tormenting them in that very moment. They pointed to places in the room where only they could see spectral witches. They writhed and screamed, providing dramatic confirmation of Tituba's testimony. All 3 women were committed to jail to await trial. But the accusations did not stop. Indeed, they had barely begun. Within days, other girls and young women in Salem Village began showing similar symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., aged 12, the daughter of one of the village's prominent families. Elizabeth Hubbard, a 17-year-old servant. Mercy Lewis, aged 19, another servant with a tragic history. She had seen her parents killed by Indians in Maine and had been brought to Salem as an orphan. These afflicted accusers would be joined by others: Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Booth, Susanna Sheldon, and eventually even some adults, including Ann Putnam's mother, Ann Putnam Sarr. The group of afflicted persons grew to include about a dozen individuals, mostly young women and girls, though with some variation in age and status. Why did the affliction spread? Modern scholars have proposed many theories. Some suggest mass hysteria or conversion disorder, psychological conditions where stress and suggestion can produce real physical symptoms. The Puritan community's intense focus on the devil and sin may have primed young people to interpret any unusual feelings or experiences in supernatural terms. Others point to the social dynamics at play. The afflicted girls suddenly had power and attention they had never experienced before. In a rigidly hierarchical society where young people, especially young women, had little agency, the afflicted found themselves at the center of community attention. Adults listened to them, deferred to them, sought their testimony. This power may have been intoxicating and difficult to relinquish. Some historians have suggested that factional conflicts in Salem Village played a role. The Putnam family, which included several of the afflicted and their relatives, was engaged in ongoing disputes with other families over land, church governance, and local politics. Accusations of witchcraft could be weapons in these conflicts, ways of striking at enemies. There may also have been elements of genuine fear and belief. These were people who truly believed in the devil and in witchcraft. When the girls spoke of specters and torments, when they fit the expected pattern of bewitchment, many observers genuinely believed they were witnessing supernatural assault. The modern skepticism about witchcraft did not exist in 1692 Salem. As March gave way to April, the number of accused persons grew. Martha Corey, a church member known for her piety, was accused. This shocked the community. If even a faithful church member could be a witch, then anyone could be. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman respected for her devotion and kindness, was accused. Her examination drew protests from supporters who could not believe such a woman could be a witch, but the afflicted girl's testimony was deemed more credible than character witnesses. Sarah Cloyce, Rebecca Nurse's sister, was accused after she walked out of a church service in protest at the proceedings. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was accused. The afflicted girls claimed her specter bit and pinched them. A 4-year-old child was chained in prison. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who had spoken skeptically about the afflictions, was accused, along with his wife Elizabeth. When Proctor's male servants defended their master, they too were accused. The net was widening, catching people of higher social status, people with good reputations, people who should have been above suspicion. A pattern emerged in how accusations worked. The afflicted girls would fall into fits, claiming to be tormented by invisible specters. Under questioning, they would name the person whose specter was afflicting them. That person would be arrested and brought for examination. During the examination, the afflicted would often go into dramatic fits. They would mimic the accused's movements. If the accused folded her hands, the afflicted would fold theirs and cry out in pain. They would claim to see spectral animals or other witches in the room. They would scream that the accused's specter was choking them, pinching them, stabbing them with invisible pins. Physical evidence was sought on the accused's bodies. Examiners looked for witches' marks, unusual moles, birthmarks, or other skin abnormalities that might be places where the witch's familiar, a demonic servant in animal form, had suckled. Any unusual mark could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft. The accused were asked impossible questions. Had they made a compact with the devil? Had they attended witch meetings? Had they afflicted the girls? Denial was taken as evidence of lying. Confession was taken as proof of guilt. There was no good answer. Some accused persons tried to fight back. John Proctor wrote letters to ministers in Boston, pleading for intervention and warning that the proceedings were unjust. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer, refused to enter a plea when accused, perhaps hoping to protect his property from seizure. Some family members stood by the accused, visiting them in jail, offering testimony to their good character. But the machinery of accusation was powerful and hard to stop. Each confession, and there were several, as some accused persons chose to confess falsely, rather than face trial and execution, seemed to confirm that the witch conspiracy was real. Each new accusation expanded the scope of the threat. The more accusations there were, the more credible the phenomenon seemed. By May 1692, dozens of people were imprisoned, awaiting trial. The jails in Salem, Boston, and Ipswich were crowded with accused witches. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, spouses from each other. The accused languished in terrible conditions, chained, poorly fed, charged fees for their imprisonment, even as their property was seized. The situation had spiraled far beyond the initial accusations of 3 marginal women. The witch hunt had taken on a life of its own, driven by the afflicted girls' continued accusations, by community fears and tensions, and by authorities who believed they were fighting a real supernatural threat to the godly colony. Central to the Salem trials was the concept of spectral evidence testimony that the accused person's specter spirit, or ghostly form, had appeared to the afflicted and tormented them. The afflicted would claim that they saw the accused person's specter, even when the accused was physically elsewhere. This spectral form would pinch, choke, and torment them. Spectral evidence was problematic, and some people recognized this even at the time. If the devil could assume anyone's shape, then seeing someone's specter was not proof that the person had consented to being a witch. The devil might be using the form of innocent persons to cause harm, precisely to create false accusations and destroy the godly community. Increase Mather, one of the colony's leading ministers, and the father of the even more famous Cotton Mather, wrote that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. He and others urged caution about spectral evidence, but this caution was not heeded in the early trials. The authorities reasoned that God would not allow the devil to assume the shape of an innocent person to do harm. Such an injustice would be against God's nature. Therefore, if the afflicted saw someone's specter tormenting them, that person must have given the devil permission to use their shape, which meant they were guilty of witchcraft. This circular reasoning made spectral evidence seem reliable, when in fact it was completely subjective and unprovable. The afflicted claimed to see things that no one else could see. There was no way to verify their testimony, no way to prove or disprove that they had seen what they claimed. Yet this unseen, unverifiable testimony became the primary evidence in most convictions. As spring turned to summer, the colonial government took action to address the crisis. Governor William Phips, newly arrived from England, established a special court of oyer and terminer, a legal term meaning to hear and determined to try the accused witches. The court was composed of prominent men: Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, who served as chief judge, judges including Samuel Sewall, John Hathorne, and others. These were not professional jurists, but colonial officials and merchants, though they had legal experience from serving as magistrates. William Stoughton proved to be a zealous witch hunter. He had no doubts about the reality of the witchcraft threat and was determined to root it out. Under his leadership, the court accepted spectral evidence and pushed aggressively for convictions. The first trial was that of Bridget Bishop, a woman with a checkered past. She had been accused of witchcraft years earlier, though not convicted. She dressed flamboyantly by Puritan standards, and she had a reputation for running a disorderly tavern. She was convicted on June 2, 1692, and hanged on June 10, becoming the first execution of the Salem witch trials. Bridget Bishop maintained her innocence to the end. She was hanged from a tree on what became known as Gallows Hill, her body left to hang as a warning before being cut down and buried in a shallow, unmarked grave. She was 60 years old. Her execution did not slow the trials. Indeed, it seemed to encourage them. If one witch had been found and executed, there must be others. The afflicted girls continued to have fits and name names. The jails continued to fill. 5 more trials and executions followed in July. Sarah Good, one of the original accused, was hanged on July 19, along with Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Weldes. Rebecca Nurse's case was particularly poignant. The jury had initially returned a verdict of not guilty, but Judge Stoughton pushed them to reconsider, and they changed their verdict to guilty. She was 71 years old, and had been respected in the community for her piety and kindness. Sarah Good, pregnant when arrested, had given birth in prison to a child who died. On the gallows, Reverend Nicholas Noyes urged her to confess. She replied, "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." This curse, according to legend, came true years later when Noyes died hemorrhaging blood. August brought 5 more hangings. John Proctor, the prosperous farmer who had spoken against the trials, was executed along with his wife Elizabeth, who was pregnant and therefore temporarily spared. But John was not. George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, was hanged despite giving a moving speech on the gallows and reciting the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something witches were supposedly unable to do. John Willard, George Jacobs Sarr, and Martha Carrier completed the group executed on August 19. George Burroughs's execution was particularly dramatic. As a minister who had become accused of being a witch, his trial attracted wide attention. The afflicted claimed he had supernatural strength, that he could lift heavy objects that no normal man could lift, evidence of his demonic powers. On the gallows, Burroughs spoke with such eloquence and piety that some in the crowd began to doubt his guilt. But Cotton Mather, on horseback, addressed the crowd and reminded them that the devil could appear as an angel of light. Burroughs was hanged. September brought the final executions. Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Rebecca Nurse's sister, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Ann Puditer, Margaret Scott, Wilmot Red, and Samuel Wardwell were all hanged on September 22, 1692. Mary Easty's case was heartbreaking. She was initially released from prison when the afflicted girls said her specter had left them, but she was re-arrested when they fell into fits again. Before her execution, she wrote a petition not pleading for her own life, which she knew was forfeit, but begging the authorities to change their procedures so that no more innocent people would die. Her plea went unheeded, and she was hanged. One death from the Salem trials stands out for its uniqueness and horror. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer, refused to enter a plea when charged with witchcraft. Under English law, a person could not be tried without entering a plea of guilty or not guilty. To force a plea, the legal system used peine forte et depressing with weights. Giles Corey was taken to a field and laid on the ground. A board was placed on his chest, and heavy stones were piled on top. The weight was increased gradually over the course of 2 days, September 17, 1692. The goal was to force him to agree to enter a plea, so that his trial could proceed. Corey never yielded. As the stones crushed his chest, making breathing agonizing, he reportedly said, "Only more weight." He died under the pressing, his chest crushed, his tongue forced from his mouth. He was the only person in American history to be pressed to death. Why did Corey refuse to plead? Some historians believe he was trying to protect his property. If he had been tried and convicted, his property would have been seized. By dying without being convicted, he could ensure that his property passed to his heirs. Others suggest he was making a statement, refusing to participate in proceedings he knew to be unjust. Whatever his reasons, Giles Corey's death was one of the most horrific moments of the Salem trials. An 80-year-old man, accused of witchcraft on spectral evidence, crushed slowly to death because he would not participate in a legal system that had become untethered from justice. By September 1692, even as the executions continued, doubts were beginning to spread. Some of the accused were people of high social standing and good reputation. The accused who confessed were spared, while those who maintained their innocence were hanged. This seemed backwards, as if the system encouraged lying. Questions about spectral evidence were being raised more forcefully. If anyone could be accused based solely on the afflicted girl's claims to see their specters, then no one. Eventually, the afflicted girls began to accuse people who were too prominent to easily arrest. They named Lady Phipps, the governor's wife, and other high-ranking persons. This may have contributed to the authorities' increasing caution. Some of the afflicted girls' accusations seemed to become more wild and less credible. They accused people in other towns, people they had never met. They began to contradict themselves. Some people who had supported the trials began to have second thoughts. In early October 1692, Increase Mather published Cases of Conscience concerning evil spirits, arguing forcefully against the use of spectral evidence. Other ministers added their voices to the critique. Governor Phipps, alarmed by how widespread the accusations had become, and perhaps worried that his own wife might be arrested, began to question the proceedings. On October 29, 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. No more trials would be held under its auspices. The witch hunt, which had lasted 8 months and claimed 25 lives, 19 hanged, 1 pressed, and at least 5 who died in prison, including Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good's infant child, was effectively over. In the months that followed, the remaining accused were gradually released from prison. Some of the trials continued under a new court in 1693, but this court refused to accept spectral evidence. Without spectral evidence, the cases collapsed. Of the few people who were convicted in these later trials, all were pardoned by Governor Phipps. The afflicted girls' fits gradually ceased. Some of the accusers later expressed regret for their role in the trials. Ann Putnam Jr. made a public apology in 1706, saying she had been deluded by Satan and asking forgiveness from the families of those she had accused. The judges and other officials were slower to acknowledge error. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, made a public confession of error in 1697, asking to be held accountable for his role in the trials. Others never admitted wrongdoing, convinced to the end that they had been fighting real witchcraft. The community of Salem was shattered. Families had been destroyed, property seized, reputations ruined. The social fabric of the village, already tense before the trials, was torn beyond repair. Salem village would never fully recover from the trauma of 1692. The colonial government eventually took steps toward restitution. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill restoring the rights and good names of those who had been accused and providing financial compensation to their heirs. The amount was insufficient to replace what had been lost, but it was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Over the centuries, there have been continued efforts to remember and honor the victims of the Salem witch trials. Memorials have been erected, names have been cleared officially, and the story has been told and retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and the failure of justice. What happened in Salem in 1692? How could a community of educated, religious people, living under English law, execute 19 people based on the visions of young girls and unprovable accusations? The Salem witch trials were the product of multiple factors, converging at a particular moment. Puritan theology, with its emphasis on the devil's active presence in the world and the reality of spiritual warfare, created a mental framework where witchcraft seemed plausible and dangerous. Social tensions in Salem village, disputes over land, the minister, and economic change created underlying conflicts that accusations could exploit. The legal system, with its acceptance of spectral evidence and its aggressive prosecution, created a machinery that was hard to stop once it started. The afflicted girls, whether driven by genuine belief, psychological distress, or social power, provided a steady stream of accusations that kept the trials going. And perhaps most important, there was a failure of critical thinking and moral courage. People who had doubts often kept quiet, rather than risk being accused themselves. Those who did speak up, like John Proctor, found themselves in the dock. The momentum of the witch hunt swept away skepticism and caution. Salem was not unique. It was part of a larger pattern of witch trials that had swept Europe for centuries, and that had occurred elsewhere in the American colonies. But Salem became the most famous example in American history, studied and memorialized as a warning about what can happen when fear overcomes reason, when the justice system serves hysteria rather than truth, and when communities turn against their own. As we continue our exploration of witch trials, we will look beyond Salem to the broader European context, examining how witch hunts began, spread, and eventually declined. We will see that Salem, for all its horror, was actually a relatively brief and limited example of a phenomenon that killed tens of thousands in Europe over several centuries. But Salem remains important because it is documented in extraordinary detail, because it occurred in a community that thought of itself as civilized and godly, and because it shows how quickly reason can fail in the face of fear, and how easily injustice can be dressed in the robes of legality. And here we pause in our journey. We have walked the dark paths of Salem in 1692, witnessed the spiral of accusations, and stood in the shadow of Gallows Hill, where 19 innocent people died. The night deepens around these memories, but you are safe in your rest, distant from these old terrors. Tomorrow we will journey across the ocean to Europe, where witch trials raged for centuries before Salem, where the scale of suffering was far greater, and where the same patterns of fear and accusation played out in countless communities. But for now, let these stories settle gently, and let sleep come softly to you. The past cannot harm you. These shadows are long behind us. Rest now, and dream peacefully. To understand the Salem witch trials, we must journey back across the Atlantic and back in time, to the European witch hunts that preceded Salem by several centuries. For the panic that gripped Massachusetts in 1692 was merely an echo, a late, distant reverberation of a phenomenon that had convulsed Europe for nearly 300 years. The Great European Witch Hunt, spanning roughly from 1450 to 1750, claimed between 40,000 and 60,000 lives, perhaps more. Unlike Salem's 8 months of madness, the European hunts stretched across centuries. Unlike Salem's relatively confined geography, the European hunts swept across the entire continent, from Scotland to Poland, from Spain to Scandinavia. Yet the European witch hunts were not a single, unified phenomenon. They were rather a series of outbreaks, varying in intensity across time and place, driven by local circumstances, but sharing common elements of belief in demonic witchcraft, a legal framework for prosecution, and social tensions that made accusations both possible and probable. In the early and high Middle Ages, roughly from 500 to 1300 AD, the Church's attitude toward magic and witchcraft was relatively restrained. Yes, the practice of magic was condemned as sinful and foolish, but it was not considered the gravest of sins, nor was it seen as representing an organized conspiracy against Christendom. The Canon Episcopi, a church document from around 96 AD, took a skeptical view of witchcraft beliefs. It suggested that claims of women flying through the night to attend assemblies presided over by the goddess Diana were delusions, tricks of the devil to be sure, but not actual physical events. Those who believed in such flights were to be corrected in their error, but the belief itself was treated as superstition rather than reality. This relatively moderate approach began to shift in the late Middle Ages. Several factors contributed to the change. The period from roughly 1300 to 1450 was a time of extraordinary stress in Europe. The Black Death, beginning in 1347, killed perhaps 1/3 of the population. Climate change brought crop failures and famine. The 100 Years' War and other conflicts devastated France and surrounding regions. The Great Schism split the Church, with rival popes claiming authority. In this atmosphere of crisis and anxiety, people sought explanations for catastrophe. Why was God allowing such suffering? One answer that gained currency was that the devil was particularly active, working through human agents to assault Christendom. Heretical movements groups that challenged church authority and orthodox doctrine were seen as part of this demonic assault. The Church's campaign against heresy in the 13th and 14th centuries established precedents that would later be applied to witchcraft. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France, the persecution of the Waldensians, the establishment of the Inquisition, all of these created both an institutional apparatus for rooting out enemies of the faith and a mental framework for understanding such enemies as part of a demonic conspiracy. The crucial turning point came in the late 15th century with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1486. Written by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor, with disputed contributions from Jacob Sprenger, this text would become the most influential guide to identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches. The Malleus Maleficarum synthesized existing beliefs about witchcraft and magic into a comprehensive demonology. It argued that witches were real, that they formed an organized sect devoted to the devil, and that they posed an existential threat to Christian society. The book provided detailed instructions for identifying witches, examining them for physical marks of their compact with the devil, interrogating them including through torture, and prosecuting them in court. Crucially, the Malleus Maleficarum was gendered. Kramer argued that women were more susceptible to becoming witches than men due to their supposedly weaker intellect, stronger carnality, and greater gullibility. While men could be and were accused of witchcraft, the witch in European imagination became predominantly female, a reversal of earlier patterns where practitioners of harmful magic were as often male as female. The book was controversial even in its own time. Many theologians and jurists rejected its arguments. The Catholic Church never officially endorsed it. Yet it went through numerous editions and was widely read, particularly in German-speaking lands. It shaped the thinking of judges, inquisitors, and prosecutors across Europe. The Malleus Maleficarum described in lurid detail what witches supposedly did. They flew through the night to attend Sabbath's gatherings, where they worshipped the devil, engaged in orgies, feasted on murdered infants, and plotted harm against Christians. They made pacts with the devil, signing his book in blood, and receiving demonic powers in return. They could curse their neighbors' crops and cattle, cause impotence and infertility, raise storms, and inflict diseases. They could transform themselves into animals. They were, in short, the enemies of everything good and godly. The first major witch trials in Europe occurred in the Alps in Switzerland, the Savoy region, and nearby territories in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. These were remote mountain regions where folk beliefs in magic and spirits remained strong, where the church's influence was less pervasive than in lowland areas, and where social tensions ran high. The trials in these alpine regions established patterns that would repeat elsewhere. Accusations often began with misfortune: a cow died, crops failed, a child fell ill. Someone would be blamed for causing this harm through magic. Under interrogation, often involving torture, the accused would confess not only to the specific harm alleged but to attending Sabbaths, worshiping the devil, and conspiring with other witches. The torture was key. Medieval and early modern legal systems, as we discussed in our previous exploration of medieval justice, accepted torture as a legitimate tool for extracting confessions. The techniques used on accused witches were the same as those used on other criminals: the strappado, the rack, thumbscrews, the application of hot irons. But there were also some methods specific to witch trials, such as sleep deprivation, forcing the accused to remain standing for days, or the swimming test. Under torture, people would confess to anything. They would admit to flying to Sabbaths, to having intercourse with demons, to causing their neighbors misfortunes. And crucially, they would name other witches, either people they had supposedly seen at Sabbaths or names they invented to make the pain stop. These extracted names would lead to new arrests, new interrogations, new tortures, and new confessions, creating chains of accusation that could engulf entire communities. This pattern: initial accusation leading to torture, torture producing confession and naming of accomplices, accomplices being arrested and tortured in turn, would drive many of the largest witch hunts. From the Alps, witch trials spread across Europe, but not uniformly. The intensity and character of witch hunting varied enormously by region, shaped by local legal systems, religious cultures, political structures, and social conditions. The Holy Roman Empire, particularly German-speaking territories, experienced some of the most intense witch hunting. The fragmented political structure, with hundreds of small principalities and bishoprics, meant that local rulers had considerable autonomy. Some became zealous witch hunters, conducting mass trials that claimed hundreds of victims. The prince-bishops of Bamberg and Wurzburg were particularly notorious, executing hundreds in the 1620s and 1630s. In these German witch hunts, the pattern escalated to terrifying proportions. Entire families might be accused and executed. Children as young as 7 or 8 were tortured and burned. The accused included not just marginal figures but prominent citizens, wealthy merchants, city councilors, even relatives of the prince, bishops themselves. The hunts became self-sustaining spirals, where each confession led to more accusations, more arrests, more confessions. France also experienced significant witch trials, though they were more scattered than in Germany. French legal procedure required careful documentation and allowed for appeals to higher courts, which provided some check on the worst excesses. Nevertheless, thousands were executed in France, particularly in frontier regions like Lorraine and in the Basque Country. The Basque witch trials of 1609-1614 merit special attention. Beginning with accusations from children and beggars, the hunt spread rapidly through the Basque region of France. Hundreds were accused, and dozens were executed before an inquisitor named Pierre de Lanker was sent to investigate. De Lanker was a zealous witch hunter who believed the entire Basque population was infected with witchcraft. He conducted mass trials, torturing confessions from hundreds of people. However, the Spanish Inquisition, which had jurisdiction over the Basque region on the Spanish side of the border, took a more skeptical approach. An inquisitor named Alonso de Salazar Frias conducted a thorough investigation and concluded that the witch scare was based on suggestion, coercion, and false confessions. His report helped end the panic, and the Spanish Inquisition thereafter took a relatively restrained approach to witchcraft accusations. Scotland experienced particularly intense witch hunting in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Scottish law permitted torture, and Scottish theology, influenced by radical Protestantism, emphasized the devil's active presence in the world. King James VI of Scotland, later James Lay of England, took a personal interest in witchcraft. After experiencing storms at sea that he attributed to witchcraft, James became convinced of the reality and danger of the witch threat. He personally attended witch trials, interrogated accused witches, and wrote a treatise on demonology. The North Berwick witch trials of 1590-1591 were among the most famous. A woman named Jalies Duncan was accused of witchcraft by her employer. Under torture, she confessed and named numerous accomplices, including schoolmaster John Fian and women named Agnes Sampson and Euphemia Mac Calcian. The accused were tortured extensively. Fian had his fingernails pulled out and his legs crushed in the boots. The confessions extracted under torture were fantastical. The accused said they had raised storms to sink King James's ship, that they had attempted to kill the king through magic, that they had attended Sabbaths where they danced with the devil. These confessions were exactly what King James wanted to hear, confirming his belief that he was the target of a demonic conspiracy. All of the accused were executed. John Fian was strangled and burned. Agnes Sampson was strangled. Euphemia Mac Calcian was burned alive. Their trials set a pattern for Scottish witch hunting that would continue intermittently for the next century, claiming perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 lives. Scottish witch trials had distinctive features. The use of torture was extensive and brutal. The accused were often subjected to sleep deprivation, forced to remain awake for days while being constantly questioned. Local ministers played active roles in identifying and interrogating witches, and there was often a strong political dimension. Witchcraft accusations could be used against enemies of the crown or the Presbyterian Church. The Scandinavian countries experienced witch trials somewhat later than Western Europe, with peaks in the 17th century. Sweden's trials were particularly notable, including the Torsaker witch trials of 1675, where 71 people were beheaded and burned in a single day, accused of stealing children and taking them to Sabbaths. In Norway and Iceland, witch trials also occurred, though on a smaller scale. Interestingly, in Iceland and Finland, a higher proportion of accused witches were male than in most of Europe, suggesting that local folk traditions about magic shaped who was vulnerable to accusation. Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Russia also experienced witch trials, though they are less well documented than trials in Western Europe. These trials often occurred later, extending into the 18th century when Western Europe was already moving away from witch hunting. The trials in Poland were particularly severe in some regions, with mass executions occurring. Russia presents an interesting case. While witch trials occurred, they were never as intense as in Western Europe. The Russian Orthodox Church took a more skeptical view of demonic witchcraft than Western churches. Accusations of harmful magic were taken seriously, but the elaborate demonology of the Malleus Maleficarum never took the same hold. Those convicted of witchcraft were more likely to face exile than execution. England's witch trials differed significantly from those on the continent. English common law did not permit judicial torture, except in extraordinary cases involving treason. This meant that confessions could not be routinely extracted through physical torment, which significantly limited the scope of witch hunting. English witch trials relied more heavily on witness testimony than confession. Accusations typically centered on maleficium, harmful magic, rather than elaborate Sabbaths and demonic pacts. A woman might be accused of cursing a neighbor's cow or causing a child's illness through magic, but the fantastic elements common in continental witch trials were often absent. England did experience witch panics, particularly during the 1640s when Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witchfinder general, traveled through East Anglia identifying witches. Hopkins used techniques like sleep deprivation and the swimming test, throwing the accused in water to see if they floated, which would indicate guilt. During his campaign, perhaps 300 people were executed. However, Hopkins's activities provoked criticism and pushback. He was accused of being motivated by profit, he charged fees for his services, and of using cruel methods. His career as a witch hunter lasted only about 2 years before he ceased his activities, and he died shortly after, in 1647. Overall, England executed perhaps 500 people for witchcraft between the 16th and 18th centuries, a significant number, but far less than Germany or Scotland. The absence of judicial torture and the requirement for witness testimony rather than mere confession created meaningful limits on witch hunting. Paradoxically, areas under the jurisdiction of the Roman Inquisition, Italy, and the Spanish Inquisition experienced relatively restrained witch hunting. While both Inquisitions prosecuted cases of witchcraft, they maintained higher standards of evidence than many secular courts. The Roman Inquisition, reorganized in 1542, took an increasingly skeptical view of elaborate witchcraft confessions. Inquisitors recognized that torture could produce false confessions and that many witch beliefs were superstitious rather than true. The Inquisition continued to prosecute witchcraft, but execution rates were much lower than in areas under secular jurisdiction. In Spain, as we noted earlier, the experience of the Basque witch trials led the Spanish Inquisition to adopt formal guidelines in 1614 that essentially ended witch hunting in Spanish territories. These guidelines required extraordinary evidence for conviction, prohibited torture in most witchcraft cases, and encouraged skepticism about fantastical confessions. This is one of history's ironies. The Inquisitions, infamous for their persecution of heretics and their use of torture, were more restrained in witch hunting than many Protestant and secular authorities. The Inquisition's legal procedures, for all their flaws, included protections and standards that limited the worst excesses of witch hunting. Italy did experience some witch trials, particularly in Alpine regions and in Venice, but they were never as intense as in Germany or Scotland. The presence of the papacy and the Roman Inquisition's relatively cautious approach helped prevent the massive witch hunts that devastated other regions. Across all these varied regions and circumstances, certain patterns recur in who was accused of witchcraft and why. Understanding these patterns helps us see witch trials not as random persecution, but as social processes shaped by power, gender, and community dynamics. The typical accused witch in Europe was a woman, usually past childbearing age, often widowed, frequently poor or at least not wealthy, and sometimes socially marginal in other ways, quarrelsome, sharp-tongued, failing to show proper deference to social superiors. This profile was not absolute. Men were accused, young women were accused, wealthy people were accused, but it was the most common pattern. Why were older women so vulnerable? Several factors contributed. Post-menopausal women had less value in a society that prized women primarily for their reproductive capacity. Widows lacked male protection and might be seen as burdens on the community, particularly if they needed poor relief. Older women who survived when others died might be suspected of using magic to preserve themselves. Women who practiced folk healing were particularly vulnerable. Midwives, herbalists, and cunning folk practitioners of folk magic for helpful purposes had knowledge and skills that could be interpreted as magical. When a healing failed, when a birth went wrong, when herbal medicine didn't work, the practitioner might be blamed for deliberately causing harm, rather than failing to prevent it. Accusations often arose from neighborhood conflicts. A woman would ask a neighbor for charity food, milk, a loan, and be refused. Shortly afterward, misfortune would strike. The neighbor who refused a cow would die, a child would fall ill, crops would fail. The coincidence would be remembered, and the woman who had been refused charity would be suspected of cursing the ungracious neighbor. This pattern is documented in countless witch trials. The accused would often be someone who had been denied charity, or who had been involved in a dispute over property lines, debts, or other neighborhood matters. The witch accusation allowed people to resolve conflicts, to punish those they resented, to explain misfortune, and to eliminate unwanted community members. Gender was central to these dynamics. Women were expected to be subordinate, deferential, quiet. Women who violated these expectations, who were outspoken, who quarreled with neighbors, who didn't show proper deference, could be labeled as witches. The accusation of witchcraft was, in many cases, a way of enforcing gender norms and punishing women who stepped outside prescribed boundaries. The sexual elements of witchcraft beliefs also reflected and reinforced gender anxieties. Witches supposedly had intercourse with the devil and demons. They attended Sabbaths where orgiastic rituals occurred. These fantasies projected male anxieties about female sexuality onto accused women, particularly older women past menopause who should have been beyond sexuality in the cultural imagination. Witch trials also had economic dimensions. In some regions, convicted witches had their property confiscated. This created a perverse incentive. Wealthy people, if accused and convicted, could enrich those who prosecuted them. Some historians have argued that witch trials served as a form of property redistribution, allowing communities to seize the assets of marginal, but relatively well-off individuals. The professional witch hunters who emerged in some regions charged fees for their services. Matthew Hopkins in England, witch commissioners in Germany. These individuals profited from witch hunting. The more witches they found, the more they were paid. This created an incentive to find witches everywhere they looked. Torturers and executioners also profited. They charged fees for their services, for the instruments they used, for the wood for the fires. Jailers charged prisoners for food and for any amenities. The entire apparatus of witch hunting could be lucrative for those who operated it, even as it was devastating for those caught in its machinery. Communities sometimes had to bear the costs of trials and executions, which could be significant. This financial burden may have served as a limit on witch hunting in some places when resources were strained. Enthusiasm for expensive trials might wane. The peak period of European witch hunting, roughly 1560–1660, coincided with the period of intense religious conflict following the Protestant Reformation. Both Catholic and Protestant territories experienced witch trials, but some of the most intense hunts occurred in confessionally divided regions. The fragmented Holy Roman Empire, with Catholic and Protestant territories intermingled, saw some of the worst witch hunting. The French Wars of Religion and the 30 Years' War created chaos and insecurity that fueled witch panics. Scotland's witch hunts intensified during periods of religious and political conflict. Both Protestant and Catholic authorities used witch trials as tools in religious competition. Successfully identifying and prosecuting witches demonstrated doctrinal correctness and godliness. Failing to prosecute witches might be interpreted as leniency toward evil. Religious minorities were sometimes vulnerable to witch accusations. Protestant communities in Catholic regions, Catholic communities in Protestant regions, and everyone's suspicion of religious nonconformists. However, the relationship between religious conflict and witch hunting was complex. Some of the most intense witch hunts occurred in religiously homogeneous regions. And as we've seen, some Catholic inquisitions were more restrained than Protestant authorities. Religious belief shaped witch hunting, but it was not a simple matter of one confession being more or less prone to witch hunting than another. Even during the height of witch hunting, there were skeptical voices questioning the reality of witchcraft and the justice of trials. These skeptics faced an uphill battle. They were arguing against deeply entrenched beliefs and risked being accused of defending witchcraft or even being witches themselves. Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft 1584 was one of the earliest and most comprehensive skeptical works in English. Scott argued that much of what was attributed to witchcraft was either fraud, coincidence, or natural causes. He questioned the reality of demonic pacts and Sabbaths. King James I was so offended by Scott's book that he ordered it burned and wrote his own treatise, Demonology, defending the reality of witchcraft. Johannes Weyer, a Dutch physician, published De Prestigiis Demonum on the tricks of demons in 1563, arguing that accused witches were often mentally ill rather than actually in league with the devil. While Weyer believed in the devil's power, he thought the devil deceived people into believing they were witches rather than actually granting them powers. These skeptical works made little immediate impact. Belief in witchcraft remained strong, and most educated people, including scientists and philosophers, accepted that witchcraft was real. Even as the scientific revolution advanced, even as skeptical empiricism grew, belief in witchcraft persisted. It would take more than intellectual arguments to end witch hunting. Social, legal, political, and cultural changes all contributed to the eventual decline, which we will explore later. But these early skeptics planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow. To understand witch trials, we must understand the witch, not the real people who were accused, but the imagined figure of the witch that existed in popular belief and learned demonology. This stereotypical witch was a construction built up over centuries from folk beliefs, theological speculation, and cultural anxieties. In early medieval folklore, practitioners of magic were not necessarily evil. They were wise women and cunning men, people with special knowledge of herbs and charms who could heal the sick, find lost objects, protect against evil, and help with practical problems. They existed in a morally ambiguous space. Their power came from knowledge rather than from God, but they used it to help rather than harm. Harmful magic also existed in folk belief. A person could cast the evil eye, curse an enemy, cause illness or death through malevolent spells. But these harmful magic users were individual malefactors, not part of an organized conspiracy. They practiced magic for personal gain or revenge, not as part of a cosmic battle between God and the devil. The learned conception of witchcraft that developed in the late Middle Ages transformed this folk understanding into something far more sinister. The witch became not just someone with magical knowledge, but someone who had made a deliberate pact with the devil, renouncing God, and becoming part of a demonic conspiracy. This transformation involved several key elements. The demonic pact: the witch had made a formal agreement with the devil. She had renounced her baptism, denied Christ, and sworn allegiance to Satan. In return, the devil granted her magical powers. This pact was sometimes sealed with the witch's signature in the devil's book, written in her own blood. The devil's mark as a sign of their pact: witches received a mark on their bodies where the devil or a demon had touched them. This mark might be invisible to normal sight, but could be found by pricking the suspected witch's body with pins. If a spot did not bleed or cause pain, it was deemed a devil's mark, proof of the pact. The Sabbath witches supposedly gathered at night for Sabbath's meetings where they worshipped the devil, engaged in perverse rituals, and plotted harm against Christians. The Sabbath included elements inverted from Christian worship prayers said backward, the desecration of the cross, the Black Mass. It also included elements of sexual transgression, orgies with the devil and demons, homosexual acts, incest. Flight witches flew through the air to reach Sabbaths, either on broomsticks, on animals, or through the devil's power. This flight was both physical and spiritual. The witch's body might remain in bed while her spirit flew to the gathering. Transformation witches could transform themselves into animals, particularly cats, hares, and wolves. They could also transform others, turning people into animals through magic. Familiars, witches had familiar spirits, demons in animal form who assisted them in their magic. These familiars would suck blood from the witch's body at special teats that served as additional devil's marks. Common familiars included cats, toads, dogs, and birds. Maleficium witches caused harm through their powers. They killed livestock, destroyed crops, caused human illness and death, raised storms, and prevented conception and childbirth. They used a variety of methods: potions, images of victims stuck with pins, charms, and incantations. Why did the witch in European imagination become predominantly female? The Malleus Maleficarum argued that women were more prone to witchcraft due to their inherent weaknesses. They were more credulous, more impressionable, more carnal, less rational than men. This misogynistic theology reflected and reinforced broader cultural attitudes about women. Women were associated with the body rather than the mind, with nature rather than culture, with chaos rather than order. These associations made them seem more susceptible to the devil's temptations. The witch represented femininity uncontrolled by masculine authority, the woman who operated outside patriarchal structures, who wielded power independently, who threatened male dominance. Sexual anxieties were central to the witch stereotype. The witch's pact with the devil often involved sexual submission. The devil appeared as a male figure, often with exaggerated sexual characteristics. The witch submitted to him sexually, in a parody of the marriage relationship. This fantasy projected anxieties about female sexuality, its power, its potential to escape male control, its supposed insatiability. The witch was often imagined as an older woman, past menopause. This reflects anxieties about women who could no longer be defined by their reproductive function. A post-menopausal woman had knowledge and experience but lacked the softening influence of maternal feelings, or so it was imagined. She was a woman freed from biological constraints, which made her dangerous. The stereotype also drew on fears of female anger and resentment. The witch was often portrayed as someone nursing grudges, someone who cursed those who wronged her. Women were expected to be forgiving and submissive. A woman who refused to forgive, who sought revenge, who expressed anger, was violating gender norms and might be a witch. The visual image of the witch developed over the 15th to 17th centuries through woodcuts, engravings, and paintings. These images both reflected and shaped popular beliefs. Early images showed witches as ordinary-looking women engaged in magic, brewing potions, reading from books of spells. Later images became more elaborate and more monstrous. Witches were shown flying on broomsticks or animals. They were depicted with physical deformities: hooked noses, warts, hunched backs. They were shown in the company of demons and familiars. Images of Sabbaths became increasingly elaborate. Hans Baldung's prints from the early 16th century showed witches gathering around fires, some naked, some riding goats backward. Later images showed full Sabbath scenes, crowds of witches, the devil presiding, perverse ceremonies being conducted. These images served multiple purposes. They entertained. Witchcraft was a subject of fascination as well as fear. They instructed, showing people what witches looked like and what they did. They warned, illustrating the consequences of making pacts with the devil. And they reinforced the reality of the witch threat, making the imagined conspiracy seem visible and concrete. The Sabbath deserves special attention because it was central to learned conceptions of witchcraft, and because confessions about Sabbaths were among the most elaborate extracted under torture. The Sabbath supposedly occurred at night, in remote locations: forests, mountains, ruined buildings. Witches flew there through the air, sometimes anointing themselves with a magical ointment that enabled flight. The number of attendees varied in different accounts from dozens to hundreds or thousands. The devil presided over the Sabbath, appearing in various forms as a large black man, as a goat, as a monstrous hybrid creature. The witches worshipped him through inverted Christian rituals. They recited prayers backward, they trampled or desecrated crosses, they performed a black mass that parodied the Eucharist. Sexual elements were prominent. The witches kissed the devil's posterior in homage. They engaged in indiscriminate orgies. The devil copulated with female witches. His penis was described as cold, painful, and unnatural. Some accounts claimed incubi and succubi, male and female demons, appeared to have sex with the witches. The Sabbath included feasting, but the food was often described as disgusting. Dead infants were supposedly cooked and eaten. The witches reportedly killed children to obtain ingredients for magical potions and ointments. Reports of Sabbaths also included accounts of dancing and music. The witches danced in circles, often backward or in otherwise inverted patterns. They sang profane songs. The atmosphere was one of chaos and disorder, the opposite of the orderly, sacred nature of Christian worship. Plans for harm were supposedly made at Sabbaths. Witches compared notes on whom they had afflicted, discussed methods for causing disease and death, and coordinated their attacks on Christian communities. Did Sabbaths actually occur? Almost certainly not in the form described in Confessions. The Sabbath as described in witch trials was a fantasy, constructed from theological speculation about demonic worship, sexual anxieties, and details extracted under torture. The consistency of Sabbath confessions across Europe has sometimes been taken as evidence that Sabbaths really occurred. If witches in Scotland and witches in Germany gave similar accounts of Sabbaths, doesn't that suggest they experienced something similar? But the consistency is better explained by the spread of the stereotype through texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, through educated elites who moved between regions, and through leading questions during interrogation. Accused witches were often told what Sabbaths involved and asked if they had attended. Under torture, they would confirm what their interrogators already believed, adding details from their imagination or from folklore to make the confession more convincing. Some historians have argued that Sabbath confessions might reflect memories of pagan festivals or of heretical religious gatherings. But the evidence for this is weak. The Sabbath as described in witch trials, with its worship of the devil in Christian terms, its inversion of Christian rituals, its emphasis on demonic pacts, is a Christian construct, not a survival of pre-Christian religion. What the Sabbath reveals is not historical reality, but the fears and fantasies of the culture that created it. The Sabbath represented everything that Christian, patriarchal, ordered society feared: uncontrolled sexuality, inverted hierarchy, chaos, the triumph of the demonic. By projecting these fears onto the figure of the witch, society created a monster that justified the most extreme measures to combat it. While the general outline of witch beliefs was similar across Europe, there were regional variations that reflected local traditions and concerns. In Germanic regions, witches were particularly associated with raising hailstorms to destroy crops. This reflected the importance of agriculture and the vulnerability of crops to weather damage. In alpine regions, witches were accused of causing avalanches. In Scotland, witches were often accused of raising storms at sea, reflecting the importance of fishing and maritime trade. The North Berwick witches supposedly tried to sink King James's ship. In some areas, particularly in Scandinavia, witches were accused of stealing milk from cows or butter from churns through magic. The witch might point at a cow from a distance and magically extract its milk, or she might send her familiar to lap up cream. Shape-shifting beliefs varied. In French and Germanic regions, werewolves, people who transformed into wolves, were sometimes conflated with witches. In Scotland and parts of England, transformation into cats or hares was more common in accusations. The figure of the devil varied too. In some accounts, he was sophisticated and seductive. In others, he was crude and animal-like. His appearance, black man, goat, hybrid creature, shifted based on local fears and folklore. These regional variations remind us that witchcraft beliefs were not monolithic. They were shaped by local circumstances, by folk traditions, by the specifics of economic and social life. A witch in Scotland looked and acted somewhat differently from a witch in Italy, even though both were imagined as part of the same demonic conspiracy. While most accused witches were women, men were also accused and executed, comprising perhaps 20–25% of witch trial victims overall, with significant regional variation. Male witches were often associated with different types of magic than female witches. They were more likely to be accused of learned magic ceremonial rituals involving books and complex procedures, rather than simple folk magic. The male witch might be an educated person, a priest or scholar gone bad, who used his learning for evil purposes. Men were also accused of making pacts with the devil and attending Sabbaths. In confessions, male witches described the same perverse rituals and demonic encounters as female witches. However, the sexual elements were sometimes different. Male witches might have intercourse with succubi female demons, rather than with the devil himself. In some regions, particularly in Iceland and Finland, the majority of accused witches were male. This reflects different folk traditions about magic in these areas, where male magical practitioners had been more common than female ones. The presence of male witches in trials complicates, but doesn't negate the gendered nature of witch hunting. Even when men were accused, the stereotype of the witch remained predominantly female. Men accused of witchcraft were often feminized in the accusations, described as effeminate, as taking passive roles in sexual encounters with demons, as exhibiting characteristics culturally coded as female. The witch, as we have examined her, was not a real person but a social construction, an imagined figure created from theology, folklore, anxiety, and fantasy. Real people were accused of being witches, but they bore little resemblance to this stereotype. The women and some men who died in witch trials were not devil worshippers. They did not fly to Sabbaths or copulate with demons. They were ordinary people, some practicing folk magic for healing or protection, some not practicing any magic at all, who became caught in a machinery of accusation, driven by the gap between the imagined witch and the real people vulnerable to accusation. Understanding the witch as a construction helps us understand the trials themselves. The trials were not about identifying people who actually did what witches were supposed to do. They were about imposing the stereotype onto real people, about forcing confessions that matched the pre-existing belief, about making reality conform to fantasy through torture and execution. The horror of the witch trials lies partly in this disconnect. People died not for what they actually did, but for what they were imagined to have done. They were executed for crimes that were impossible, for a conspiracy that existed only in imagination, for a threat that was projected onto them by a fearful society. We pause here in our exploration, having traced the origins of the European witch hunts and examined the construction of the witch herself, that imagined figure of terror that justified so much suffering. The night deepens around these dark histories, but you remain safe and distant from these old terrors. When we continue, we will examine the peak of the European witch hunts, focusing on the regions and periods where persecution was most intense. We will see how the patterns we've identified played out in specific historical cases, and we will continue to ask how these tragedies could have occurred. But for now, rest. These are stories from long ago, shadows from a world we have left behind. Let them settle in your mind as history, not as present fear. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the dungeons are empty, the stakes cold, and the witch hunts ended. As we journey deeper into the history of witch trials, we must now confront the periods and places where persecution reached its most terrible intensity. The years from approximately 1580 to 1630 saw the peak of European witch hunting, with certain regions experiencing mass trials that claimed hundreds or even thousands of lives. To understand the full horror and tragedy of the witch hunts, we must examine specific cases in detail, moving beyond general patterns to see how real people in real communities experienced this nightmare. We will focus on 3 regions where persecution was particularly intense: the Prince-Bishoprics of Germany, the frontier regions of France, and Scotland under the influence of religious reform. In the small Prince-Bishopric of Wurzburg in Franconia, Germany, One of history's most devastating witch hunts unfolded between 1626 and 1631. Under Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Arenberg, approximately 900 people were executed for witchcraft in just 5 years, an extraordinary death toll for a population of only about 15,000. Wurzburg in the 1620s was a troubled place. The 30 Years' War had begun in 1618, bringing violence and instability to German territories. The war was both political and religious, Catholic and Protestant powers fighting for dominance, with local populations caught in between. Economic hardship, military occupation, disease, and displacement created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf was a zealous Catholic determined to root out what he saw as spiritual threats to his territory. He believed witchcraft was rampant and that only aggressive prosecution could save his people from demonic influence. He appointed equally zealous commissioners to conduct witch trials, built a special witch house for interrogating and holding accused witches, and created an apparatus designed to identify and eliminate witches efficiently. The Wurzburg trials differed from earlier, scattered witch accusations in their systematic, bureaucratic character. This was witch hunting as a coordinated campaign, with dedicated facilities, professional staff, and streamlined procedures for processing large numbers of accused. The pattern began, as so many witch hunts did, with marginal figures, beggars, elderly women, outsiders. Under torture, these initial accused confessed to witchcraft and named accomplices. These named individuals were arrested, tortured, and in turn named others. The chain of accusations grew exponentially. But in Wurzburg, the hunt did not stop with the vulnerable and marginal. It began to consume the elite. City councilors were accused, wealthy merchants, priests and canons from the cathedral chapter, members of prominent families. Even children. The youngest victim was just 7 years old when executed. One of the most poignant documents from the Wurzburg trials is a letter written by Johannes Junius, a burgomaster mayor of Bamberg, a neighboring city experiencing similar mass trials. Junius wrote to his daughter from prison, describing his ordeal. He had been arrested, accused of witchcraft, and tortured. Junius described the torture in detail: the thumbscrews that crushed his fingers, the leg vises that broke his shins, the strappato that dislocated his shoulders. He explained that he had initially refused to confess, despite the agony, because he was innocent and hoped God would sustain him. But the torture continued. After being subjected to the strappato multiple times, after days of sleeplessness and torment, Junius broke. He confessed to being a witch, to attending Sabbaths, to renouncing God. He named other supposed witches, people whose names he had heard mentioned by his torturers, or whose names came to mind in his desperation to make the pain stop. Innocence will not help, he wrote to his daughter. Even if you are as virtuous as the Virgin Mary, they will force you to confess. He explained that he had confessed falsely, that everything he said under torture was lies invented to satisfy his torturers. He begged his daughter not to believe the accusations against him. The letter was smuggled out of prison. Shortly after writing it, Johannes Junius was burned at the stake. His daughter kept the letter, and it survived as testimony to the injustice of the trials and the innocence of at least some of those condemned. The Wurzburg trials eventually ended in 1631, when Swedish troops invaded the region as part of the 30 Years' War. The chaos of military invasion interrupted the witch hunts, and they were never resumed at the same intensity. Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf fled and died in exile. The machinery of witch hunting he had created was dismantled. But the damage was done. 900 people were dead. Families were destroyed. A generation of leaders, the merchants, counselors, and professionals who should have guided the city, had been decimated. The community's social fabric was torn beyond easy repair. Bamberg, where Johannes Junius had been burgomaster, experienced trials that paralleled those in Wurzburg. Under Prince Bishop Johann Georg II, Fuchs von Dornheim, approximately 600 people were executed between 1623 and 1632. Prince Bishop Johann Georg was deeply convinced of the reality and danger of witchcraft. He had a special witch house built, the Drudenhaus witch prison, specifically designed for holding and interrogating accused witches. It included a torture chamber equipped with all the instruments necessary for extracting confessions. The Bamberg trials followed the same pattern as Wurzburg: initial accusations of marginal persons, torture, extracted confessions, naming of accomplices, expansion to include elite victims. Among those executed were the Chancellor of the Bishopric, numerous councillors, and wealthy citizens whose property was confiscated after execution. The trials were partly driven by financial motives. The Prince Bishop and his officials profited from the seized property of convicted witches. Executioners and torturers earned fees for each person processed. The apparatus of witch hunting became a business, with financial incentives to find more witches. However, reducing the trials to mere financial exploitation would be too simple. Prince Bishop Johann Georg genuinely believed he was fighting a supernatural threat. He saw the witches as agents of the devil, working to destroy Christian society. The fact that prosecuting witches was also profitable did not make him doubt the righteousness of his mission. The Bamberg trials, like those in Wurzburg, ended with the disruption of the 30 Years' War. Swedish Protestant forces invaded, the Catholic Prince Bishop fled, and the witch trials ceased. But again, hundreds had died, and the community bore scars that would last for generations. The Prince Bishopric of Trier, in western Germany, experienced earlier but equally devastating witch trials. Between 1581 and 1593, approximately 368 people were executed for witchcraft in the city of Trier and surrounding villages. These trials occurred during the reign of Archbishop Johann von Schönenberg, who was convinced that witchcraft was responsible for the poor harvests and wine crops that plagued the region in the 1580s. The economic crisis created by agricultural failure, combined with religious tensions, Trier was a Catholic enclave in a region with many Protestant territories, created conditions ripe for witch hunting. The Trier trials were notable for their use of torture and for the social range of victims. People from all levels of society were accused and executed. The trials consumed entire villages in the village of Saarburg. All but 2 adult women were reportedly executed as witches. Contemporary observers noted the horror of the Trier trials. Linden, a contemporary historian, wrote, "Inasmuch as it was popularly believed that the continued sterility of many years was caused by witches through the malice of the devil, the whole country rose to exterminate the witches. So many witches had been burned that now there were only widows and orphans in the villages." The Trier trials demonstrated how economic crisis could fuel witch hunting. When crops failed and wine harvests were poor, people sought explanations. The natural explanation, poor weather, exhausted soil, agricultural practices, seemed inadequate to explain persistent failure. A supernatural explanation that witches were cursing the land seemed to account for why God would allow such suffering. If witches were causing crop failure, then eliminating witches should restore prosperity. This logic drove people to support aggressive witch hunting, even as it consumed their neighbors and family members. The promise that executing witches would bring back good harvests made the trials seem necessary, even urgently so. We touched on these trials earlier when discussing King James VI's involvement, but they deserve closer examination as an example of how political power and witch belief could combine with devastating effect. The North Berwick trials began with the interrogation of a young woman named Jalise Duncan, a maidservant who seemed to have unusual healing abilities. Her employer, David Seaton, suspected her of witchcraft. He had her tortured using thumbscrews and other devices until she confessed. Under torture, Jalise Duncan named numerous other witches, including a schoolmaster named John Fyon and several women from Edinburgh and the surrounding area. All of those named were arrested and subjected to torture. The confessions extracted were elaborate and detailed. The accused described attending Sabbaths at North Berwick Church, where they danced and worshipped the devil. They confessed to attempting to kill King James Vasi through magic, raising storms at sea, to sink his ship when he sailed to Denmark to fetch his bride, Princess Anne. King James took personal interest in the trials. He attended interrogations, questioned the accused himself, and even suggested torture methods. The trials confirmed his belief, which he would later express in his book Demonology, that witchcraft was a real and terrible threat aimed particularly at righteous rulers. John Fiennes' torture was particularly savage. His legs were crushed in the boots, a device that broke the bones of the shins. His fingernails were pulled out and needles driven into the nail beds. He initially confessed under torture but later recanted, insisting he was innocent. His recantation led to more torture. His head was twisted with a rope until his eyes nearly popped from their sockets. Still, he maintained his innocence, or at least that his previous confession had been false. He was eventually strangled and burned. Agnes Sampson, a midwife and healer, was also tortured extensively. She was subjected to sleep deprivation, forced to remain awake for days while being constantly questioned. She was stripped and searched for the devil's mark. Her head was shaved, and a witch's bridle, a metal device with sharp prongs, was put on her face. Under this torture, she confessed to elaborate rituals and meetings with the devil. King James questioned her directly, and she told him details of his private conversations with his bride on their wedding night, details she supposedly learned from the devil. James was convinced she was genuinely a witch because she knew things she could not have known otherwise, though modern analysts suggest she may have learned such details through ordinary gossip. Most of the North Berwick accused were executed, strangled, and then burned. Their trials set a precedent for Scottish witch hunting that would continue intermittently for over a century, claiming perhaps 1,500–2,000 lives in a country with a population of only about 1 million. France experienced witch trials throughout the period of the hunts, but one case stands out for its peculiar character: the Loudon possessions, which combined witch accusations with demonic possession of nuns. In 1632, in the town of Loudon, nuns at an Ursuline convent began exhibiting strange behaviors. They screamed, convulsed, made obscene gestures, and spoke in voices claiming to be demons. The nuns said they were possessed by devils who had been sent by a priest named Urbain Grandier through witchcraft. Urbain Grandier was a controversial figure in Loudon. He was educated, eloquent, and sexually scandalous. He had fathered children with various women despite being a priest. He had made enemies through his political alliances and his sharp tongue. When the nuns accused him of bewitching them, his enemies saw an opportunity to destroy him. The possessed nuns were examined by physicians and exorcists. They displayed behaviors that seemed to confirm demonic possession, speaking in languages they supposedly didn't know, revealing hidden information, blaspheming against God. During exorcisms, conducted publicly as spectacles, the nuns would go into fits when the consecrated host was brought near or when exorcists commanded the demons to manifest. Grandier denied the accusations. He had never met most of the nuns, he argued, and could not have bewitched them from a distance. He suggested the nuns were deluded or were being manipulated by his enemies, but the evidence seemed to be against him. The nuns, under exorcism, identified Grandier as their bewitcher. Documents supposedly signed by Grandier and various demons were produced, though handwriting experts noted the signatures all appeared to be in the same hand. Political authorities, including Cardinal Richelieu, who had reasons to oppose Grandier, supported the prosecution. Grandier was arrested, tried, and convicted of witchcraft. He was tortured to extract a confession. His legs were crushed in the boots until his broken bones pierced through the skin. He refused to confess. His stoicism under torture impressed some observers and convinced them of his innocence, but it did not save him. On August 18, 1634, Urbain Grandier was burned alive. The executioner had been bribed to strangle him before the flames took hold, but the bribe was discovered and prevented. Grandier burned alive, taking many minutes to die. Witnesses reported that he maintained his innocence to the end. The possessions at Loudon continued for years after Grandier's death, suggesting that his execution had not actually freed the nuns from their affliction. The case became famous across Europe, documented in numerous accounts, and later inspiring books and films. Modern historians view the Loudon case as a combination of mass hysteria, political intrigue, and the manipulation of religious beliefs for personal vendettas. The nuns may have experienced genuine psychological disturbances, perhaps triggered by the repressive convent environment. Their symptoms became interpreted as possession, and possession required a witch to have caused it. Grandeur, with his enemies and his scandalous life, was a convenient scapegoat. England, as we noted, experienced less intense witch hunting than continental Europe due to the absence of judicial torture. But England did have witch trials, and one of the most famous was the Pendle witch trial of 1612. Pendle Forest in Lancashire was a remote, poor region where Catholic recusants, those who refused to attend Church of England services, lived in some numbers. In this region, several families were known for practicing folk magic. Cunning folk who used charms, curses, and healing spells. The case began with a dispute between two of these families, the Demdikes and the Chattoxes. Old Demdike Elizabeth Southerns and Old Chattox Anne Whittle were elderly women who had practiced folk magic for years. They were rivals, each accusing the other of causing harm through magic. The situation escalated when Elizon Device, granddaughter of Old Demdike, cursed a peddler named John Law after he refused to give her some pins. Shortly after, Law suffered a stroke. Law's son accused Elizon of bewitching his father. Elizon, feeling guilty about the curse she had spoken, confessed to causing the stroke through witchcraft. This confession triggered a wider investigation. Elizon named other witches, including her own family members and the rival Chattox family. Magistrates arrested numerous suspects. Without the use of torture, which was illegal in English common law, the magistrates relied on witness testimony and the suspects' own confessions. Several of the accused did confess, perhaps believing it would lead to lenient treatment, perhaps genuinely believing they had magical powers, perhaps mentally ill or confused. They described familiar spirits in the form of animals, dogs, cats, and other creatures who helped them in their magic. They admitted to killing people through curses and charms. The trial took place at Lancaster in August 1612. Of the 11 people tried, 10 were convicted and hanged. Only one, Alice Gray, was found not guilty. Among those executed were both Old Demdike's family members, though Old Demdike herself had died in prison before trial, and members of the Chattox family. The Pendle trials became famous partly because the trial was documented in detail by the clerk of the court, Thomas Potts, whose account, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster, was published and widely read. Potts presented the trial as a triumph of justice over evil witchcraft. Modern analysis suggests the Pendle accused were practitioners of folk magic who genuinely believed in their own powers, combined with innocent people caught up in family feuds and accusations. The confessions, given without torture, may reflect genuine belief in magic, rather than mere capitulation to pain. Not all witch accusations led to execution. Some accused individuals managed to escape conviction, though often only after years of ordeal. The case of Katharina Kepler, mother of the famous astronomer Johannes Kepler, illustrates both the arbitrary nature of accusations and the possibility of resistance. Katharina Kepler was accused of witchcraft in 1615 in the Duchy of Württemberg. She was an elderly widow known for being difficult and argumentative. Her knowledge of herbs and healing made her suspect. When a neighbor woman fell ill after drinking a potion Katharina had mixed, the neighbor accused Katharina of poisoning her through witchcraft. Katharina was arrested and imprisoned. She faced interrogation and the threat of torture. If she had been in Wurzburg or Bamberg during the mass trials, she almost certainly would have been tortured, forced to confess, and executed. But Württemberg had different procedures. Torture could be used, but only after a formal vote by legal officials, and it required strong evidence. Defense was permitted. The accused could have advocates argue their case. Johannes Kepler, one of the most brilliant scientists of his age, devoted himself to defending his mother. He hired lawyers, marshaled evidence of her good character, challenged the testimony of accusers, and used his own prestige and connections to influence the proceedings. The case dragged on for 6 years. Katharina remained imprisoned for much of this time, enduring terrible conditions. She was shown the instruments of torture in an attempt to frighten her into confession, but she refused to confess to what she had not done, and her son's defense prevented the authorities from proceeding to torture. Finally, in 1621, Katharina was released. The evidence was deemed insufficient for conviction. She died the following year, at age 75, her health broken by her imprisonment but her life spared. The Kepler case shows that survival was possible, but it required resources, wealth to hire lawyers, connections to influence officials, determination to resist pressure. Poor women without powerful advocates rarely escaped once accused. What do these cases teach us about the peak period of witch hunting? Several patterns emerge: social range of victims. During the most intense hunts, accusations expanded beyond the marginal to include elite victims. When trials became mass phenomena, no social position provided safety. Wealth, status, and respectability, which usually protected people from accusations, became insufficient shields during panic. Role of torture in regions that permitted judicial torture. Most of continental Europe, torture drove the expansion of trials. Each tortured confession produced names of new accused, creating chains of accusations. Without torture, as in England, trials remained more limited in scope. Economic and political context. Major witch hunts often occurred during periods of crisis: war, crop failure, economic hardship, political instability. The 30 Years' War coincided with some of the worst German trials. Crop failures preceded the Trier trials. Crisis created anxiety that witch hunting channeled. Role of authorities. Zealous leaders like the prince bishops of Wurzburg and Bamberg could drive intense persecution. Their belief in witchcraft, their determination to root it out, and their control of legal machinery enabled mass trials. Conversely, skeptical or moderate authorities could limit trials, as we saw with the Spanish Inquisition. Difficulty of resistance. Once accused, resistance was dangerous and difficult. Maintaining innocence could lead to torture. Flight could lead to trial in absentia and seizure of property. The best defense was powerful advocates and a legal system with safeguards, both of which were rare. Ultimate futility. The witch hunts did not achieve their ostensible goals. Crops did not improve when witches were burned. Wars did not end. Prosperity did not return. The promised benefits of eliminating witches never materialized, yet belief in the necessity of witch hunting persisted for decades. The witch trials depended on specific legal procedures and interrogation methods. Understanding these procedures helps us see how ordinary legal systems became machines for producing mass convictions, and how the gap between seeking truth and forcing confession was bridged through torture and procedural manipulation. Witch trials typically began with an accusation. The source varied. A private individual might accuse a neighbor, local authorities might initiate an investigation based on rumor, or an ongoing trial might produce names of new suspects. In some jurisdictions, making a false accusation of witchcraft carried penalties, which theoretically discouraged frivolous accusations. In practice, this protection was limited. By the time an accusation was proven false, the accused might already be dead or ruined. Anonymous accusations were generally not permitted, though this rule was not always enforced. The accuser was supposed to testify publicly and face the accused, but in cases involving spectral evidence, as in Salem, the accuser might claim to have been harmed by the accused's invisible spirit, rather than through direct physical contact. Once an accusation was deemed credible, authorities would issue a warrant for arrest. The accused would be taken to prison to await examination and possible trial. This imprisonment could last weeks, months, or even years. Prison conditions were terrible. Accused witches were often held in dungeons, chained, denied adequate food and sanitation. They might be held in isolation to prevent them from using magic to escape, or to harm their jailers. The psychological and physical toll of imprisonment was severe, weakening resistance before interrogation even began. Families of the accused often faced consequences too. Children might be taken from accused mothers. Property might be seized immediately upon arrest, before conviction. The social stigma of accusation meant neighbors and friends distanced themselves, leaving the accused isolated. Before formal trial, the accused would face examination by magistrates or other authorities. This was an investigative procedure designed to determine if there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. The examination typically occurred in a public setting, with spectators allowed to observe. The accused would be questioned about the specific accusations. Had they harmed certain people through magic? Had they attended Sabbaths? Had they made a pact with the devil? The questions were often leading. When did you first meet the devil? Rather than did you meet the devil? This framing assumed guilt and asked only for details. The accused who denied guilt entirely might be accused of lying and subjected to harsher interrogation. Witch hunters sought physical evidence of witchcraft on the accused's body. This search for devil's marks was invasive and humiliating. The accused would be stripped naked and their entire body examined. Searchers looked for unusual marks, moles, birthmarks, scars, warts, skin tags, hemorrhoids, anything that seemed abnormal. Any such mark might be deemed a devil's mark or a witch's teat, where familiar spirits supposedly suckled. These marks would be pricked with pins or needles. The theory was that devil's marks would not bleed and would be insensible to pain. In practice, any spot that had less sensation than surrounding areas, perhaps due to scar tissue or that bled less readily, could be identified as a devil's mark. Women's bodies were particularly scrutinized. Anything about female anatomy that examiners found unusual or disturbing: a prolapsed uterus, enlarged labia, any gynecological abnormality, could be interpreted as evidence of witchcraft or sexual congress with demons. The body search was both an investigative procedure and a form of punishment and humiliation. It stripped the accused of dignity and privacy. For women who valued modesty as most did in this period, being stripped and examined by strangers was deeply traumatic. In some regions, particularly in England and Scotland, the swimming or floating test was used. The accused would be bound, sometimes with thumbs tied to opposite big toes, and thrown into water. The theory was that water, a pure element used in baptism, would reject a witch. If the accused floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, though they might drown in the process of proving their innocence. The swimming test was controversial even in its own time. Many legal authorities condemned it as superstitious and unreliable. King James V/I, despite his belief in witchcraft, wrote that the swimming test was not valid proof. Yet it persisted in some areas because it seemed to provide objective evidence of guilt or innocence. From a modern perspective, the swimming test was worse than useless. The human body naturally has some buoyancy, and whether someone floated or sank depended more on body composition, how they were bound, and luck than on guilt or innocence. But belief in the test's validity meant that floating was often taken as damning evidence. In most of continental Europe, torture was a routine part of witch interrogations. The legal theory was that torture, properly applied according to rules, would extract truth from those who refused to confess voluntarily. As we explored in detail in our previous documentary on medieval torture, the methods were various: the rack, the strappado, thumb screws, leg vises, the application of fire, sleep deprivation, and many others. For accused witches, these standard torture methods were sometimes supplemented by specific techniques like forcing the accused to remain standing for days or subjecting them to extreme cold. The purpose of torture in witch trials was primarily to extract confessions. Under the legal standards of the time, confession was the strongest proof of guilt. Physical evidence was helpful, witness testimony valuable, but confession was paramount. Torture was theoretically subject to restrictions. It required authorization by proper authorities. It was supposed to be applied in gradations, starting with lighter methods and escalating only if necessary. There were supposed to be limits on duration and intensity. The accused could be tortured only a limited number of times for the same accusation. In practice, these restrictions were often ignored or circumvented. A torture session might be continued, rather than counted as a new session, allowing interrogators to torture the accused repeatedly. The gradations of torture could be compressed, moving quickly from light to severe. The presence of physicians to monitor the accused's health might ensure they didn't die during torture, but didn't prevent extreme suffering. Under torture, most accused witches eventually confessed. The confession would typically include several elements. The pact: the accused would describe meeting the devil and making a pact with him. They would detail what the devil looked like, what he promised, what they agreed to in return. They would admit to renouncing God and Christ. The mark: they would explain how the devil marked them, confirming the physical mark that examiners had found on their body. The familiar: they would describe demonic spirits in animal form that assisted them. They would explain how these familiars suckled from them. Harmful acts: they would confess to specific maleficia, causing illness, death, crop failure, storms, impotence, and other harms through magic. The Sabbath they would describe attending Sabbaths, providing details of what occurred there: the worship of the devil, the perverted rituals, the planning of harm against Christians. Other witches, crucially, they would name other witches they had supposedly met at Sabbaths, or who had recruited them into witchcraft. These confessions followed predictable patterns because interrogators asked leading questions, and because the accused had often heard what confessions should contain. The consistency of confessions was taken as evidence of their truth, when it actually reflected the consistency of the interrogation process. Legal theory required that confessions obtained under torture be confirmed freely afterward. The accused would be removed from the torture chamber, given time to recover, and then asked to confirm their confession without torture or threat of torture. This safeguard was largely meaningless. The accused knew that if they recanted their confession, they would be tortured again. Many confirmed their confessions simply to avoid returning to the torture chamber. Some who did recant were indeed tortured again, often more severely, until they confessed once more. A few stubborn souls repeatedly recanted despite renewed torture. These cases troubled the legal system. If someone confessed under torture, recanted freely, was tortured again and confessed again, recanted again, and so on, what was the truth? Most courts eventually accepted the confession and proceeded to trial and conviction, reasoning that the pattern of confession under torture and recantation when free showed the devil's influence, rather than the confession's falsity. If the examination produced sufficient evidence, which usually meant a confession, the case proceeded to formal trial. Witch trials followed the inquisitorial model used in continental Europe, rather than the adversarial model later common in English and American law. In an inquisitorial trial, the judge took an active role in investigating and questioning. There was no presumption of innocence in the modern sense. The prosecution presented evidence, the accused could offer defense, and the judge determined guilt or innocence. Defense in witch trials was difficult. The accused might not have access to legal counsel. Evidence that would help their case, like character witnesses, might be deemed less important than the confession. Spectral evidence, testimony about invisible spirits that only the accuser could see, might be admitted despite being impossible to verify or refute. The trial was often a formality. By the time a case reached trial, the accused had usually already confessed, and confession made conviction nearly certain. The trial served to publicly confirm guilt and legitimize the sentence, rather than to genuinely determine whether the accused was guilty. Verdicts could be guilty, leading to sentence of death, almost always by burning. Not guilty rare, and occurring mainly when evidence was very weak or the accused had powerful protectors. Remanded for further investigation, allowing more time for interrogation and torture. Those convicted of witchcraft faced death, almost always by burning at the stake. The reasoning was both practical and theological. Fire would consume the witch's body completely, preventing any remains that might become objects of veneration or superstition. Fire also symbolized purification and was associated with hell, making it a fitting death for those who had allied with the devil. The sentence might include additional penalties: confiscation of property, declaration that the person had died infamous affecting their family's status, prohibition on Christian burial for any remains. Some convicted witches were granted the mercy of being strangled before the fire was lit, sparing them the agony of burning alive. This mercy might be extended to those who confessed and showed repentance, or might be paid for by the family. Those who maintained their innocence to the end, or who could not pay for mercy, burned alive. The execution was public, conducted as a spectacle meant to demonstrate the power of justice and to deter others from witchcraft. Crowds attended, sometimes numbering in the thousands for particularly notable cases. The condemned was led to the stake, sometimes given an opportunity to make a final statement, and then bound to the stake as the fire was lit. Accounts of executions describe the terrible suffering of those who burned alive. The heat would cause the body to writhe and contort. The screams would continue until smoke inhalation silenced them. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air. Executions could take many minutes, with the condemned slowly consumed by flames. After the execution, the ashes would be scattered or buried in unconsecrated ground. the witch's property would be distributed according to the sentence, often enriching those who had prosecuted the case. Some legal systems allowed for appeals to higher courts. This provided a theoretical check on unjust convictions, but in practice, appeals were difficult. They required money for lawyers and court fees, time during which the accused remained imprisoned, and often traveled to distant courts. Few convicted witches had the resources to mount effective appeals. Even when appeals occurred, higher courts often deferred to lower courts on questions of fact. If a lower court had determined someone was a witch based on evidence and confession, the higher court might not revisit that determination. Appeals might address procedural issues, but leave the underlying conviction intact. Pardons from secular rulers or the Pope could save convicted witches, but these were rare. A ruler might issue a pardon as an act of mercy, in response to petitions from the condemned's family, or if new evidence emerged. But pardons were exceptional, not regular features of the system. These procedures varied across regions and jurisdictions. The Inquisition, both Spanish and Roman, had different procedures than secular courts. England, with its common law system, had different rules than continental countries using Roman law. Scotland's procedures differed from England's, but certain elements were common: the assumption that witchcraft was real and dangerous, the use of torture or pressure to extract confessions, the acceptance of spectral evidence and dubious physical signs, the difficulty of mounting effective defense, and the high conviction rate once someone was formally accused. The procedures, for all their variations, were systematically biased toward conviction. Once accused, the witch had very little chance of acquittal. The machinery of interrogation and trial was designed to confirm suspicions and produce confessions, not to objectively determine truth. Not everyone accepted the reality of witchcraft or the justice of witch trials. Throughout the period of the hunts, there were skeptical voices questioning the proceedings, challenging the evidence, and arguing for restraint or outright abolition of trials. These skeptics faced serious obstacles. Expressing skepticism about witchcraft could itself be dangerous. One might be accused of defending witches, or even being a witch oneself. Yet some brave individuals did speak out, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually contribute to the decline of witch hunting. Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician, was one of the earliest and most important skeptics. His book De Prestigiis Daemonum, on the tricks of demons, published in 1563, challenged many assumptions underlying witch trials. Weyer did not deny the existence of the devil or of demons. He was a devout Christian who accepted the reality of spiritual warfare. But he argued that the devil deceived people rather than granting them actual powers. Women accused of witchcraft were not actually witches, Weyer argued, but were either mentally ill, suffering from melancholy and delusion, or were victims of the devil's tricks. Weyer argued that confessions obtained under torture were unreliable. He noted that people would say anything to make the pain stop. He observed that many accused witches were elderly, confused, or mentally unstable people who might genuinely believe they had magical powers, but who were deluded rather than genuinely in league with the devil. Weyer's work was controversial and was attacked by defenders of witch hunting, including the prominent demonologist Jean Bodin. Weyer was accused of being too lenient toward witchcraft and of being influenced by the devil himself. His work was placed on the Catholic Index of Prohibited Books. Despite the opposition, Weyer's ideas influenced some authorities. His patron, Duke William of Cleves, adopted more skeptical approaches to witchcraft accusations in his territories. Weyer's arguments would be echoed and expanded by later skeptics. Reginald Scot, an English gentleman and member of Parliament, published The Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584, offering a comprehensive skeptical critique of witch beliefs. Scot went further than Weyer. He questioned not just whether accused witches were actually guilty, but whether witchcraft as described in trials was even possible. Could people really fly through the air? Could they transform into animals? Could they raise storms through magic? Scot argued that these supposed powers were impossible, that they violated natural law, and that confessing to them was either fraud or delusion. Scot examined specific cases of witch trials and exposed the weaknesses in evidence. He discussed how supposed proofs of witchcraft floating in the swimming test having unusual marks on the body, making confessions under torture were unreliable, and could be explained without recourse to genuine witchcraft. Scott also criticized the witch hunters themselves, accusing them of credulity, cruelty, and greed. He noted how torture could produce any confession desired, and how the property of executed witches enriched those who prosecuted them. King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, despised Scott's book. James believed deeply in witchcraft, and wrote Demonology partly as a response to Scott. When James became King of England, he reportedly ordered copies of Scott's book burned. Despite this royal opposition, Scott's works circulated and influenced English attitudes toward witchcraft. Friedrich Spee was a German Jesuit priest who served as a confessor to accused witches in the final hours before their execution. This experience gave him intimate knowledge of the trials and their injustice. Spee's book, Cogito Criminalis, Precautions for Prosecutors, published anonymously in 1631, was a powerful critique of witch trials based on his direct experience. Spee had heard the confessions of numerous condemned witches, and many had told him they were innocent, that they had confessed falsely under torture. Spee argued that the procedures used in witch trials were fundamentally unjust. Torture, he noted, would make anyone confess to anything. The requirement to name accomplices ensured that accusations spread to innocent people. The use of spectral evidence and dubious physical signs meant that conviction was based on unreliable proof. Spee wrote movingly about the suffering of the innocent. He described how good people, faithful Christians, were accused of witchcraft based on flimsy evidence or malicious gossip. He detailed how torture broke them and forced them to confess to impossible crimes. He mourned that they died as condemned witches when they should have been honored as martyrs to injustice. Cogito Criminalis had significant impact. It was read by rulers and church authorities, and it contributed to growing skepticism about witch trials in Catholic territories. Some prince-bishops who had previously supported aggressive witch hunting became more cautious after reading Spee's work. Alonso de Salazar Frias, whom we mentioned earlier, was a Spanish inquisitor whose thorough investigation of the Basque witch trials led to their end and to the Spanish Inquisition adopting skeptical guidelines for witchcraft cases. In 1609 and 1610, a witch panic erupted in the Basque region. Hundreds of people, including many children, confessed to attending Sabbaths and practicing witchcraft. Some local inquisitors conducted trials that resulted in executions and brutal punishments. Salazar Frias was assigned to investigate. Unlike many inquisitors, he approached the investigation with genuine skepticism. He traveled through the affected regions, interviewing accused witches, alleged victims, and witnesses. He examined the evidence carefully and tried to verify the confessions. Salazar Frias concluded that the witch scare was based on suggestion, fear, and coerced confessions. Children had been pressured to confess and had then implicated adults. Confessions of attending Sabbaths were fantasies, produced through leading questions, and the accused telling interrogators what they wanted to hear. There was no credible evidence of actual witchcraft. In his report to the Inquisition's governing council, Salazar Frias wrote, "I have not found even indications from which to infer that a single act of witchcraft has really occurred." He recommended that the Inquisition approach witchcraft cases with extreme caution, require strong corroborating evidence beyond confession, and avoid using torture in such cases. The Inquisition accepted Salazar Frias's recommendations and issued instructions in 1614 that effectively ended witch hunting in Spanish territories. This was one of the earliest official rejections of witch hunting by a major authority. The skeptics were initially voices crying in the wilderness. For decades, their arguments had little impact on the majority of educated opinion or on legal practice. Belief in witchcraft remained strong among both learned elites and ordinary people. But gradually, skepticism spread. Several factors contributed: repeated injustices, as more cases emerged of obviously innocent people being convicted, as more people like Johannes Junius wrote about their false confessions, confidence in the trials eroded. The execution of priests, city councilors, and children in the German mass trials shocked even those who supported witch hunting in principle. Intellectual changes, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about evidence, causation, and knowledge. The emerging scientific worldview was less hospitable to beliefs in demonic magic and more insistent on natural explanations for phenomena. Religious changes, as the intensity of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation conflicts declined, as religious warfare gave way to relative peace, the urgency of rooting out spiritual enemies diminished. Religious authorities could afford to be more measured about witchcraft. Legal reforms. Some jurisdictions reformed their legal procedures, raising standards of evidence, limiting the use of torture, and providing better protections for the accused. These reforms made witch convictions more difficult. By the late 17th century, witch trials were declining in most of Western Europe. The last execution for witchcraft in the Dutch Republic occurred in 1608, in England in 1682, in Scotland in 1727, in France in 1745. Trials continued longer in some regions in Eastern Europe, in some German territories, in Switzerland, but the peak had passed. The skeptics' arguments had not single-handedly ended witch hunting, but they had provided intellectual ammunition for those who had doubts, had offered alternative explanations for phenomena attributed to witchcraft, and had helped create a climate where witch trials seemed increasingly barbaric and irrational. Here we pause once more in our journey. We have examined the peak of the witch hunts in specific detail, seen how interrogation and trial procedures worked, and met those brave souls who questioned the madness even when questioning was dangerous. The night continues, but you rest safe, far removed from these old terrors. When we resume, we will trace the decline of witch hunting and explore what these trials teach us about human nature, about justice, and about the perils of mass hysteria. For now, let these stories rest in your mind, as history important to remember but distant in time. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the witch hunts ended, that reason eventually prevailed, and that the lessons learned have helped protect against such injustices in our own time. As we enter the final portion of our journey through the history of witch trials, we turn from the darkness of persecution to the slow dawn of reason and reform. The decline of witch hunting was not sudden, nor was it universal or inevitable. It occurred unevenly across Europe and the Americas, driven by multiple factors: intellectual, social, legal, and cultural. Understanding how witch hunting ended is as important as understanding how it began. The decline shows that even deeply entrenched beliefs and practices can change, that societies can recognize their errors and correct course, and that the arc of history, while not inevitably bending toward justice, can be pushed in that direction through human effort and courage. By the late 17th century, the intellectual foundations of witch hunting were eroding. The scientific revolution had transformed how educated Europeans understood the natural world. Scientists like Isaac Newton explained natural phenomena through mathematics and physical laws, rather than through supernatural intervention. This new scientific worldview left less room for witches raising storms or causing crop failures through demonic power. The Enlightenment brought new emphasis on reason, evidence, and skepticism. Philosophers like Voltaire, who had championed the posthumous exoneration of Jean Calles and others wrongly convicted, ridiculed belief in witchcraft as superstition unworthy of rational people. The encycleptists and rational philosophers made witch hunting seem not just wrong but absurd, a relic of a darker, more ignorant age. New understandings of mental illness and psychology also contributed to skepticism. Medical writers increasingly argued that behaviors attributed to bewitchment or possession could be explained as natural diseases. Convulsions, fits, strange speech patterns, these could be symptoms of epilepsy, hysteria, or other medical conditions rather than evidence of supernatural influence. Christian Thomasius, a German philosopher and jurist, published works in the late 17th and early 18th centuries arguing forcefully against witch trials. His treatise De Crimine Magiae on the crime of magic, published in 1701, combined legal arguments against torture with philosophical arguments against belief in harmful witchcraft. Thomasius's work influenced German universities and helped shift legal opinion against witch hunting. Balthasar Bekker, a Dutch Reformed minister, published De Betoverd Wereld de World Bewitched in 1691, arguing that the devil had no power to act in the physical world, and therefore could not grant witches magical abilities. Becker's work was controversial. He was removed from his ministry for these views, but it circulated widely and influenced educated opinion. These intellectual developments did not immediately end witch hunting. Many people continued to believe in witchcraft, even as elite opinion shifted towards skepticism. But the intellectual respectability of witch hunting was undermined. Conducting witch trials increasingly marked authorities as backward and superstitious, rather than as defenders of godly order. Changes in legal systems and procedures made witch convictions more difficult and eventually impossible. The most important change was the restriction and eventual abolition of judicial torture. As we explored in our previous documentary on medieval justice, torture had been the engine driving many witch trials. Without torture, the chains of accusations that created mass panics could not form. Without torture, confessions of attending Sabbaths and making demonic pacts confessions that provided the main evidence in most trials dried up. Prussia under Frederick the Great abolished judicial torture in 1754. Austria followed in 1776. France abolished preparatory torture used to extract confessions in 1780 and preliminary torture used to force the condemned to reveal accomplices in 1788. Smaller German states abolished torture throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The abolition of torture meant that witch trials, as they had been conducted, became legally impossible. Without torture, few people confessed to witchcraft. Without confessions, and with growing skepticism about spectral evidence and dubious physical signs, convictions could not be obtained. Legal reforms also raised standards of evidence. Courts began requiring corroboration for accusations, began treating confessions obtained under duress as unreliable, began insisting on concrete proof of harm rather than accepting testimony about invisible specters. These higher standards made witch convictions difficult to obtain even in jurisdictions that still formally recognized witchcraft as a crime. Some jurisdictions went further, explicitly decriminalizing witchcraft. The English Witchcraft Act of 1735 repealed earlier witchcraft laws and made it a crime to pretend to have magical powers, thus targeting fraud, but not to actually practice magic, since the law assumed magic was not real. This was a remarkable shift. The law now assumed that witchcraft was impossible, and that anyone claiming to be a witch was a fraud or deluded. Even as the intellectual and legal foundations of witch hunting crumbled, trials continued in some regions into the 18th century. These late trials were often controversial even at the time, with critics pointing to them as examples of backward superstition that enlightened society should abandon. Anna Gurldy, Switzerland, 1782. Anna Gurldy was the last person executed for witchcraft in Europe. She was a maidservant in the Swiss canton of Glarus, who was accused by her employer of bewitching his daughter. The girl had vomited pins, and Gurldy was blamed for causing this through magic. Gurldy was tortured and confessed. She was tried, convicted, and executed by beheading, not burning, as the authorities were embarrassed by the archaic nature of a witch execution and tried to make it resemble a standard criminal execution. Even at the time, the case provoked criticism. The authorities in Glarus were accused of judicial murder and of clinging to outdated superstitions. Modern examination of the case suggests Gurldy was innocent, and that her employer may have had other motives for wanting her gone. There are hints that he had sexually assaulted her and wanted to silence her. Whatever the truth, her execution stands as the final official witch execution in Europe, a grim coda to centuries of persecution. The Dorochow witch trial, Poland, 1775-1776. In Poland, witch trials continued later than in Western Europe. In 1775-1776, several women in the town of Dorochow were accused of witchcraft and executed. Polish intellectual and legal elites criticized these trials as barbaric, but, in remote regions, traditional beliefs persisted. Witch trials in the Americas. Witch trials also declined in the 18th century, but at different rates. We have already explored the Salem trials of 1692, which were the last major witch hunt in colonial North America, though isolated trials continued later. In Latin America, under the Spanish and Portuguese colonial administrations, witch trials were rare and were subject to the skeptical approach of the Inquisitions. Indigenous peoples accused of witchcraft were sometimes punished, but the elaborate European demonology was not usually applied to their practices. The end of witch trials did not mean the end of belief in witchcraft. Long after legal systems stopped prosecuting witches, many ordinary people continued to believe in the reality of harmful magic. In rural areas throughout Europe and America, folk beliefs about witchcraft persisted into the 19th and even 20th centuries. People might suspect their neighbors of cursing their livestock or causing illness through magic. They might consult cunning folk for protection against witchcraft or for counter magic to undo curses. But these persistent beliefs no longer led to legal prosecutions. The gap between popular belief and elite/legal opinion had widened. What had once been a crime prosecuted by the state became a matter of private belief and folk practice. Occasionally, belief in witchcraft still led to violence, but now such violence was illegal. There are cases of accused witches being attacked or even killed by mobs in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but these were prosecuted as crimes, murder or assault, rather than as justified actions against genuine witches. The story of Bridget Cleary in Ireland in 1895 illustrates this shift. Bridget's husband and relatives killed her, claiming she had been taken by fairies and replaced with a changeling. They burned her body, believing this would force the fairies to return the real Bridget. The husband and relatives were arrested and tried for murder. Their belief in supernatural explanations was not accepted as justification. They were convicted and imprisoned. This case shows how belief in the supernatural had been relegated to the realm of private superstition, no longer validated by legal systems or elite culture. Killing someone because you believed they were a witch or a changeling was now murder, not a defense of community. Historians have debated what factors were most important in ending witch hunting. The reality is that multiple factors converged to make witch trials increasingly rare and eventually impossible. Intellectual skepticism provided elite justification for ending trials. When educated people no longer believed in demonic witchcraft, they could not in good conscience prosecute it. Legal reforms removed the procedural mechanisms that had made witch trials possible. Without torture, without acceptance of spectral evidence, trials could not proceed. Social and economic changes reduced the anxieties that had fueled witch hunting. As economies stabilized, as religious warfare ended, as communities became less isolated and insular, the social tensions that accusations had expressed or exploited diminished. Enlightenment values emphasized individual rights, due process, and protection against arbitrary punishment. These values were incompatible with witch trials' presumption of guilt and reliance on forced confessions. Embarrassment and reputation played a role. By the late 17th century, conducting witch trials marked a jurisdiction as backward. Rulers who wanted to appear modern and enlightened distanced themselves from witch hunting. Institutional changes in churches reduced emphasis on the devil's active presence. While Christianity continued to acknowledge spiritual evil, the focus shifted toward personal sin and morality, rather than cosmic warfare with demons. No single factor explains the decline. Rather, witch hunting became unsustainable as the multiple pillars supporting it, intellectual, legal, social, religious, eroded over time. As witch hunting declined and then ended, some effort was made to rehabilitate victims and acknowledge the injustice of trials. This process was slow and incomplete, but it represented recognition that terrible wrongs had been committed. In Massachusetts, the colonial legislature in 1711 reversed the attainders' legal declarations of guilt that carried penalties for families of some Salem witch trial victims and provided financial compensation to their families. The amount was insufficient to replace what had been lost, but it was an official acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Some of the Salem jurors and accusers also made public apologies. In 1697, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood in church while his apology was read aloud. asking to be held accountable for his role in the trials. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the chief accusers, made a public confession, saying she had been deluded by Satan, and asking forgiveness from the families of those she had accused. In Europe, rehabilitation was more scattered. Some families petitioned to have the honor of executed relatives restored. Some jurisdictions quietly overturned convictions, but systematic effort to identify and exonerate all witch trial victims did not occur until much later. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, some governments have issued formal apologies and pardons for witch trial victims. In 2008, the Swiss canton of Glarus officially exonerated Anna Gurldy. In Scotland, campaigns have sought official pardons for all those convicted under the Witchcraft Act, though as of this writing, comprehensive pardons have not been granted. These modern rehabilitations are largely symbolic. The victims are long dead, and nothing can undo the suffering they endured. But symbolism matters. Formal acknowledgement of injustice, public commemoration of victims, official repudiation of the trials. These acts affirm values of justice and human rights, and commit to not repeating the errors of the past. The witch trials, though ended, live on in memory and culture. How we remember them, what stories we tell, what lessons we draw, what meaning we make of this dark history shapes our understanding of justice, persecution, and human nature. In American culture, the Salem witch trials occupy a unique position. They are among the most famous events of colonial American history, taught in schools, depicted in countless books and films, referenced whenever concerns about mass hysteria or persecution arise. Arthur Miller's play The Crucible, 1953, cemented Salem's place in American cultural memory. Miller wrote the play as an allegory for McCarthyism and the anti-communist investigations of the 1950s. By drawing parallels between the witch trials and contemporary political persecution, Miller made Salem relevant to modern concerns about conformity, accusations, and the abuse of power. The Crucible has been performed countless times and is standard reading in American schools. It has shaped how Americans understand Salem as a cautionary tale about hysteria, about the danger of accusations without evidence, about the courage required to stand against unjust authority. But Miller's Salem is a particular interpretation, not straightforward history. The play simplifies the complex social dynamics of Salem Village, creates fictional romantic subplots, and presents the witch trials primarily through the lens of individual moral choice rather than systemic social forces. The real Salem was more complicated than the Crucible suggests. The accusers were not simply lying or malicious, they may have been experiencing genuine psychological distress. The judges were not merely corrupt or power-hungry, they believed they were fighting real witchcraft. The dynamics of gender, class, and community conflict that shaped the trials are difficult to capture in dramatic form. Nevertheless, the Crucible has succeeded in keeping Salem in cultural memory and in making the trials meaningful for contemporary audiences. Whether the play's interpretation is historically precise may matter less than its success in making people think about persecution and justice. European memory of witch trials is more fragmented than American memory of Salem. This is partly because European trials were so dispersed, they occurred in hundreds of different jurisdictions over several centuries, with no single event as symbolically central as Salem is in America. In some regions that experienced intense witch hunting, there is strong local memory. Bamberg has museums and memorials addressing its witch trial history. Louisburg has plaques and monuments. Salem, Massachusetts has museums, walking tours, and annual commemorations. But in many places, witch trials have been forgotten or remain obscure. The trials occurred so long ago, and the victims were often humble people who left few traces. Local memory faded as generations passed, and what remains is often vague, a general awareness that witch trials happened, without detailed knowledge of local cases. Some towns and regions have wrestled with how to remember this history. Should witch trials be commemorated publicly? Should victims be memorialized? Is there value in keeping alive memory of events from so long ago, or does dwelling on them risk opening old wounds and stirring up conflicts? Different communities have answered these questions differently. Some have embraced commemoration as a way of teaching about tolerance and justice. Others have preferred to let sleeping memories lie, seeing no benefit in revisiting painful history. Witch trials appear frequently in popular culture. Films, television, novels, and even video games draw on witch trial history for drama and horror. Films like The Witches of Salem, 1957, The Witch 2015, and numerous others have depicted witch trials. These films range from historical drama to horror, from relatively accurate depictions to highly fictionalized accounts. Television series have featured witch trial episodes or entire seasons. American Horror Story Coven included Salem witch trial backstory. Historical dramas set in the period often include witch accusations as plot elements. Novels have explored witch trials from multiple angles. Historical fiction like The Heretic's Daughter by Kathleen Kent about Salem or Alias Grace by Margaret Atwood about a 19th-century Canadian case with parallels to witch trials use the trials to explore gender, power, and justice. Young adult literature has been particularly drawn to witch trial themes. Books for teenagers often feature protagonists accused of witchcraft, persecuted for being different, and fighting against unjust systems. These stories use historical witch trials as frameworks for contemporary concerns about conformity, persecution of outsiders, and the courage to be different. This popular culture presence keeps witch trials in public consciousness, but it also risks distortion. Popular depictions often emphasize drama and horror at the expense of historical accuracy. They may present witch trials as irrational madness from a primitive past, obscuring the ways in which the trials were systematically organized and justified by the standards of their time. Academic study of witch trials has evolved significantly over the past century. Early historians often accepted that witch trials represented primitive superstition or religious fanaticism being overcome by modern reason. More recent scholarship has complicated this narrative. Feminist historians have examined witch trials through the lens of gender, arguing that the trials were in part expressions of patriarchal control over women, particularly women who violated gender norms or who threatened male power. This interpretation emphasizes how the majority of victims were women and how witch beliefs were deeply gendered. Social historians have focused on community dynamics, showing how witch accusations expressed local conflicts over property, status, and interpersonal relationships. This approach sees trials less as top-down persecution than as eruptions of community tensions. Religious historians have examined the theological underpinnings of witch belief and how Reformation and counter-Reformation conflicts shaped witch hunting. They have shown that witch hunting was not simply irrational, but followed from particular theological assumptions that seemed reasonable within their religious framework. Legal historians have traced how witch trials fit into broader systems of criminal justice, and how changing legal standards contributed to the trial's decline. They have shown that witch trials were not lawless persecution, but operated within legal frameworks, however unjust those frameworks might have been. Anthropological and cross-cultural studies have compared European witch trials to witch beliefs and witch accusations in other cultures, finding both similarities and differences. This comparative approach helps identify which aspects of European trials were culturally specific and which reflect more universal human tendencies. All of this scholarship enriches our understanding, but also creates complexity. Simple narratives, which trials were about religious fanaticism, or which trials were about persecuting women, give way to more nuanced accounts that acknowledge multiple factors and avoid monocausal explanations. Physical memorials to witch trial victims serve both to honor the dead and to remind the living of the dangers of persecution. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992, on the 300th anniversary of the trials, consists of a small park with stone benches inscribed with the names of the 19 executed and the facts of their deaths. Visitors can walk among the benches, reading the inscriptions, contemplating the injustice that occurred. In Scotland, various memorials commemorate witch trial victims. Plaques mark places where trials occurred or where witches were executed. Some memorials explicitly acknowledge that those executed were innocent, and that the trials represented a miscarriage of justice. In Germany, memorial stones and plaques in towns like Bamberg and Wurzburg name victims and explain what happened to them. These memorials serve educational purposes, helping residents and visitors understand their town's dark history. The Witches' Well in Edinburgh, near the castle, commemorates the approximately 300 women burned as witches in that location. A fountain bears the inscription. This fountain, designed by John Duncan RSA, is near the site on which many witches were burned at the stake. The wicked head and serene head signify that some used their exceptional knowledge for evil purposes, while others were misunderstood and wished their kind nothing but good. The bronze snake head shows that even if the evil one is destroyed, the serpent's head lives still. This inscription reflects the complexity of memory, acknowledging both that some accused may have practiced folk magic, though not harmful witchcraft, and that many were completely innocent, while also recognizing that witch hunting itself was evil, regardless of what the accused had actually done. Commemorating witch trial victims raises questions. Who exactly are we commemorating? The victims were real people, but in most cases we know little about them as individuals. We have names from trial records, sometimes ages and occupations, occasionally details about accusations, but we rarely have rich biographical information that would allow us to know them as full people. We commemorate them less as specific individuals than as representatives, victims of injustice, martyrs to intolerance, cautionary figures reminding us of what can happen when fear overcomes reason. This symbolic commemoration is valuable, but also involves a kind of abstraction, turning real people with complex lives into symbols for our contemporary concerns. There's also the question of what lesson commemoration should teach. Is the primary lesson about the danger of superstition, about gender-based persecution, about the importance of due process, about the power of mass hysteria, about religious fanaticism? All of these interpretations are possible, and different memorials emphasize different lessons. The meaning we make of witch trials reflects our own time's concerns as much as it reflects historical reality. Each generation finds in the trials what it needs to find confirmation of its own values, warnings against its own dangers, precedents for its own struggles. The witch trials occurred centuries ago, but they continue to resonate because they illuminate perennial human tendencies as the susceptibility to mass hysteria, the power of accusations to ruin lives, the difficulty of defending against charges of invisible crimes, the ways communities can turn against their own members. The term witch hunt has entered common language as a metaphor for unfair persecution, particularly persecution based on accusations that are difficult to disprove. When politicians claim they are victims of a witch hunt, they invoke Salem and its kin, suggesting they are being persecuted for crimes they did not commit, based on flimsy or fabricated evidence. Like all metaphors, the witch hunt comparison can be apt or misleading, depending on how it's applied. Some modern investigations do share characteristics with historical witch hunts. They involve accusations that are difficult to disprove. They rely on testimony that cannot be easily verified. They create pressure for the accused to confess even if innocent. They can spiral beyond their initial targets. But the metaphor can also be misused. Being investigated or criticized is not equivalent to being tortured and burned at the stake. Modern legal systems, for all their flaws, have far more protections for the accused than existed in witch trials. Simply being accused of wrongdoing, even unfairly, is not the same as facing the machinery that condemned thousands to death. The power of the witch hunt metaphor lies in its ability to evoke the horror of false accusation and unjust persecution. But overuse or misuse of the metaphor can trivialize actual witch trials and obscure real differences between modern controversies and historical persecution. While witch trials as legal proceedings ended in Europe and America centuries ago, belief-driven persecution of accused witches continues in some parts of the world. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Tanzania, Ghana, and Nigeria, accusations of witchcraft still occur, sometimes leading to violence against the accused. These modern witch accusations share some characteristics with historical European trials. They often target vulnerable people, particularly elderly women. They arise in contexts of misfortune and crisis. They reflect community tensions. In Papua New Guinea, witch accusations have led to brutal violence, including torture and murder of accused witches. These cases have prompted the government to repeal colonial-era sorcery laws and to work against such violence, but belief in harmful witchcraft remains strong in some communities. In India, particularly in rural areas, accusations of witchcraft have led to violence against accused women. Indian authorities have struggled to address this problem, balancing respect for local beliefs with the need to protect people from violence. These contemporary cases remind us that witch accusations are not simply historical curiosities, but reflect persistent human tendencies to scapegoat, to seek supernatural explanations for misfortune, and to persecute the vulnerable. The specific cultural context differs from European witch trials, but some underlying dynamics are similar. Beyond literal witch accusations, there are modern phenomena that share structural similarities with historical witch hunts, the Satanic Panic 1980s-1990s in the United States and some other countries. A moral panic emerged around claims that satanic cults were conducting ritual abuse of children. Investigations were launched, people were prosecuted, and some were convicted based on recovered memories and children's testimony that was later shown to be unreliable. The McMartin preschool trial in California, where 7 teachers were accused of satanic ritual abuse, became the longest and most expensive trial in American history. Ultimately, no convictions stood. The case showed how suggestions to children during interviews could create false memories, how moral panic could override skepticism, and how lives could be destroyed by accusations of impossible crimes. The Satanic Panic shares features with witch trials: belief in an organized conspiracy of evil, reliance on testimony about events that left no physical evidence, acceptance of children's accusations as inherently truthful, and creation of a climate where skepticism was seen as defending evil. Sexual abuse scandals, on the other hand, real abuse has occurred in institutions that initially dismissed accusations as modern witch hunts. The Catholic Church sexual abuse scandal showed how institutions could hide real crimes by claiming accusers were engaged in a witch hunt against the church. This illustrates the complexity of applying witch hunt comparisons. Sometimes accusations are false and destructive, resembling historical witch hunts. Sometimes accusations are true and necessary, and claims of witch hunting are defensive attempts to avoid accountability. Distinguishing between genuine injustice, like historical witch trials, or the Satanic Panic, and necessary accountability, like legitimate investigations of real wrongdoing, requires careful attention to evidence, fair procedures, and intellectual honesty, exactly the qualities that were absent in witch trials. The internet and social media have created new dynamics around public accusations that have some parallels to witch trial mechanisms. Viral accusations. A single accusation on social media can spread globally within hours, creating instant reputational damage. The accused may have little ability to defend themselves effectively, particularly if the accusation fits pre-existing narratives or stereotypes. Pile-on effects. Once someone is accused, others may add their own accusations or interpretations, creating a cascade effect reminiscent of how witch accusations spread in early modern Europe. The accused becomes a symbol rather than a person. Difficulty of defense. Defending against accusations on social media is challenging. The accused cannot cross-examine accusers, cannot present evidence in a structured way, and faces an audience predisposed to believe accusations. This asymmetry resembles the procedural disadvantages faced by accused witches. No clear resolution. Social media accusations rarely have clear resolution. There is no trial that results in acquittal or conviction, no formal process for determining truth. The accused may be permanently tainted by accusations, even if they were false. However, significant differences exist between social media accusations and witch trials. No one is being tortured or executed. The accused typically has some ability to respond. There are often genuine questions about wrongdoing that deserve investigation, rather than simply being dismissed as witch hunting. The challenge is navigating between two dangers: dismissing all accusations as witch hunts, which protects wrongdoers, and accepting all accusations without scrutiny, which enables false accusations and destroys innocent people. Historical witch trials remind us of the terrible consequences of the latter error, but we must not let that memory blind us to real wrongdoing. What can we learn from witch trials that applies to contemporary concerns? The danger of unverifiable accusations. Witch trials showed how allowing convictions based on evidence that cannot be independently verified, spectral evidence, dreams, visions, leads to injustice. Modern systems should insist on corroborable evidence and should be skeptical of accusations that depend entirely on one person's word against another's without any way to determine truth. The unreliability of coerced confessions. Torture extracted countless false confessions in witch trials. Modern interrogation, while not involving medieval torture, can still be coercive. Lengthy sessions, psychological pressure, false promises or threats can all lead innocent people to confess. Recognition of this danger has led to reforms like recording interrogations, limiting their duration, and requiring Miranda warnings, but the basic lesson remains. Confessions obtained under duress are unreliable. The power of mass psychology. Witch trials showed how communities could become convinced of impossible conspiracies and could participate in persecuting their own members. Modern examples of moral panic, conspiracy theories, and mass delusion show that this human tendency persists. Critical thinking, insistence on evidence, and willingness to question popular narratives are necessary safeguards. The importance of procedural protections. Accused witches had few meaningful protections: no right to counsel, no presumption of innocence, no effective right to confront accusers. Modern legal systems have built-in protections precisely because of historical examples of injustice like witch trials. These protections should be defended and maintained, even when protecting unpopular defendants. The danger of moral certainty. Witch hunters were certain they were right, certain they were fighting genuine evil, certain that harsh measures were justified by the threat they faced. This certainty enabled terrible cruelty. Intellectual humility. Recognizing that we might be wrong, that our beliefs might be mistaken, that what seems obvious might be false, is a safeguard against fanaticism. The courage required to dissent. Those who questioned witch trials risked being accused themselves. The pressure to conform, to accept the dominant narrative, to not defend the accused, was intense. The skeptics who spoke up anyway, despite the risks, showed moral courage that we should honor and emulate. Vigilance against scapegoating. Witch trials often targeted the vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, the socially marginal. When societies face crisis, there is always temptation to find scapegoats, to blame outsiders or unpopular groups for problems that have complex causes. Awareness of this tendency can help us resist it, and so we come to the end of our long journey through the history of witch trials. We have walked the streets of Salem as accusations spread. We have witnessed the mass trials of Germany. We have examined the beliefs that made witch hunting thinkable, and the procedures that made it possible. We have met the victims, the accusers, and those who questioned the madness. The witch trials represent one of humanity's darker chapters, a period when fear, superstition, and legal authority combined to create machinery for destroying innocent lives. Thousands died, tens of thousands suffered, communities were torn apart. The scale of suffering was immense, yet this dark history also contains lessons and even grounds for hope. The witch trials ended. Societies recognized their error and changed course. The beliefs that enabled witch hunting were challenged and eventually rejected. Legal systems reformed to prevent such injustices. This change did not happen automatically or inevitably. It required the courage of skeptics who questioned dominant beliefs despite the risks. It required intellectuals who developed new ways of thinking about evidence and justice. It required authorities willing to reform systems and admit error. It required ordinary people gradually losing faith in witch hunting as they witnessed its horrors. We inherit the legacy of both the trials and their end. We live in a world shaped by Enlightenment values that emerged partly in reaction to witch hunting values of evidence, reason, individual rights, and skepticism of authority. Our legal protections: presumption of innocence, right to counsel, prohibition of torture. Rules of evidence exist partly because of historical examples like witch trials that showed what happens without such protections. But we also inherit human nature that has not fundamentally changed. We remain capable of the fears, the prejudices, the mass psychology that enabled witch trials. We remain capable of scapegoating, of believing impossible conspiracies, of persecuting the vulnerable. The machinery may look different: social media rather than torture chambers, reputational destruction rather than burning at the stake, but underlying tendencies persist. As we close, let us remember some names not as abstractions but as people. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, known for her piety and kindness, initially found not guilty by a jury but convicted when the judge pressured them to reconsider, hanged at Salem on July 19, 1692. Giles Corey, 80 years old, pressed to death under stones rather than participate in proceedings he knew to be unjust, dying on September 19, 1692. His last words reportedly more weight. John Proctor, a prosperous farmer who spoke skeptically about the afflicted girls and their fits, arrested with his wife, separated from his children, hanged on August 19, 1692, leaving his pregnant wife to bear their child in prison. Johannes Junius, burgomaster of Bamberg, who wrote to his daughter from prison, explaining that innocence would not save him, that torture had forced him to confess falsely, burned at the stake in 1628, his letter surviving as testimony to injustice. Anna Gerldy, a maidservant in Switzerland, the last person legally executed for witchcraft in Europe, beheaded in 1782, in a proceeding that embarrassed authorities even as they carried it out. And so many others: Agnes Sampson, George Burroughs, Bridget Bishop, Martha Corey, Mary Eastie. People with names, lives, families, hopes and fears, all destroyed by witch hunting. We remember them not to dwell in sorrow but to honor their suffering, and to commit ourselves to preventing similar injustices. Their names remind us that statistics: 40,000 dead, 60,000 dead, represent individual human beings, each with their own story of pain and loss. Fear is the thread running through our entire exploration. Fear of the devil and demons. Fear of crop failure and disease. Fear of neighbors who seemed threatening or strange. Fear of conspiracy and hidden enemies. Fear of divine judgment for tolerating evil. Fear that drove communities to terrible acts they believed were necessary. Fear remains powerful in our own time. We fear terrorism, disease, economic collapse, social change, those who seem different or threatening. Fear can be rational. Some threats are real and deserve serious response. But fear can also override reason, can make impossible conspiracies seem plausible, can make persecution seem like protection. The witch trials teach us to be aware of fear's power, and to question whether our responses to fear are proportionate and just. Are we protecting genuine safety or attacking scapegoats? Are we addressing real threats or imagined conspiracies? Are we maintaining justice or abandoning it in the name of security? These are not easy questions, and historical awareness does not automatically provide answers. But understanding how fear consumed communities in the past can make us more thoughtful about how we respond to fear in the present. Our journey has taken us through darkness, but we emerge into light. The witch trials ended. Justice, however belatedly, was eventually done to victims whose names were cleared and honor restored. The legal protections we now take for granted were built partly on the ruins of witch trial injustice. This is not a story of inevitable progress. History does not automatically bend toward justice. But it is a story that shows progress is possible, that societies can learn from their errors, that even deeply entrenched wrongs can be recognized and corrected. The skeptics who questioned witch hunting when questioning was dangerous showed that individual courage matters. The jurisdictions that reformed their laws showed that institutions can change. The victims who maintained their innocence to the end showed that human dignity persists even in the face of terrible injustice. We honor their memory not through mere remembrance, but through vigilance, by protecting the legal rights they lacked, by questioning the certainties that led to their persecution, by extending empathy to the accused and vulnerable, by insisting on evidence before condemnation, by having the courage to dissent when communities embrace persecution. The witch trials were a tragedy, but they are not our whole story. They are a chapter in human history that shows us at our worst cruel, fearful, ready to destroy the innocent to assuage our anxieties. But the end of witch trials shows us at our better capable of reason, of reform, of recognizing and correcting injustice. We carry both possibilities within us. We can succumb to fear and scapegoating, or we can resist them through reason and compassion. We can participate in persecution, or we can speak up for justice even when it is risky. We can accept dominant narratives uncritically, or we can insist on evidence and fairness. The choice is ours, in our own time, with our own challenges. The witch trials are past, but their lessons remain vital. May we learn from this dark history. May we remember the victims. May we commit ourselves to justice, to reason, to compassion. May we never forget how easily communities can turn against their own, and may we have the wisdom and courage to prevent such tragedies in our own time. And now, dear listener, our journey through the witch trials comes to an end. You have walked with me through Salem and across Europe. You have witnessed persecution and suffering, but also resistance and eventual reform. You have seen the darkness of which humans are capable, but also the light of those who questioned and who worked for justice. As you drift toward sleep, let these stories settle in your mind, not as nightmares, but as lessons important to remember but distant in time. The witch trials belong to history. The dungeons are empty, the stakes are cold. The trials have ended. We live in a different world, one shaped partly by the recognition of the errors those trials represented. We have legal protections they lacked. We have scientific understanding they did not possess. We have or should have intellectual humility about our own certainties. But we must remain vigilant. The human tendencies that enabled witch trials, fear, scapegoating, mass hysteria, persecution of the different persist. Each generation must choose to resist these tendencies, to insist on justice, to protect the vulnerable, to question rather than accept, to show courage rather than conform. Sleep now in peace. Dream of a world that has learned from history, that protects the innocent, that insists on justice. Dream of communities bound by compassion rather than fear, by reason rather than superstition, by human dignity rather than persecution. The long night of witch trials has ended. The dawn of reason and justice, however imperfect, has come. We honor the victims by remembering them, by learning from their suffering, and by committing ourselves to protecting human rights and human dignity in our own time. Rest well, traveler through dark history. The stories are told, the lessons learned, the victims remembered. Tomorrow brings new challenges and new opportunities to choose justice over persecution, reason over fear, compassion over cruelty. Good night. May your dreams be peaceful, and may the lessons of history guide us all toward a more just and humane world.